She was a devoted wife and mother who wanted nothing more than to have her own slice of the American dream.
She was like a really sweet person. She was like very tender-hearted.
Her husband was handsome, he valued education, and he shared Harriet's dream of building a successful family here in the United States.
But in the dead of night, a violent attack rips this family apart.
Two guys just jumped in my house. They're like, don't make me have to kill you. Don't get your mom killed.
When they head into the master bedroom, there's blood everywhere.
She had been slaughtered.
To be killed in such a violent way sends a different message.
But who had a motive to kill this loving mother?
Your mom's dead. No! No, she's not! She's not!
She had absolutely no enemies.
Every direction that detectives looked, they could not find anything.
Years go by as her killers walk free, until investigators determine enough is enough.
We decided that it was time to think outside the box.
Police put together a sting operation.
It was a great moment. Then, just as quickly as that moment came, we were back to the nail biting.
I was kind of in the bottom of my stomach, like, oh shoot, this is like really not good.
Okay, he's driving off. Not sure what happened.
September 29th, 2004. On this cool autumn night, most residents of Westminster, California are sound asleep.
Westminster's a smaller bedroom community, about 11 square miles. It is about 5 to 10 miles from the beach. It can be busy. It can also be a quiet city.
But at 3:30 a.m., the typical quiet night is interrupted by a disturbing 911 call from 17-year-old Ryan Gergis.
Ryan Gergis called in a panic to say that he had been attacked.
Sir, what happened? Two guys just jumped in my house, and then they tied me up and they put me in the closet. Are they gone now? I don't know, I'm running to the neighbor's house.
Ryan is frantic because his mother, 55-year-old Harriet Gergis, may be in danger.
My mom was inside the house, but they probably beat her up and took her or something. I don't know. I didn't want to stay around.
He doesn't know what to do, so he grabs his phone and he runs out of the house.
Aren't you concerned about your mother? I am concerned about my mother. That's why I don't want to go in there and have nothing on me. They're like, don't make me have to kill you. Don't get your mom killed.
Ryan says, I was in fear for my life. I was in survival mode.
If it were me, I'd be very concerned about my mother. I want you to go back to your house. I know, but I don't want to go back and have them there and they sue me. We'll be out there in a minute, okay?
Egyptian beauty Harriet Gergis was known for always putting others before herself.
She was like a really sweet person. She was like very tender-hearted. She was just very compassionate.
Harriet had big dreams of getting married and starting a family in the United States. And in 1980, her dreams became a reality.
Friends and family of Harriet in Egypt said that they found a nice young man that they wanted to set her up with, Magdi Gergis.
Magdi Gergis checked all the boxes Harriet was looking for.
He was handsome, he valued education, and he shared Harriet's dream of building a successful family here in the United States.
The two wasted no time tying the knot.
The marriage itself was arranged, and it occurred within 2 weeks.
After the wedding, the couple moved to Long Beach, California, where they were blessed with 2 sons, Richard and Ryan.
They built a life for themselves and did whatever they could to provide for their kids over the years.
My mom would work in like a sterile lab, like actually soldering like the chips and stuff.
However, Magdi was the primary breadwinner in the family. He worked as a respiratory therapist at Torrance Memorial Hospital.
Like many immigrants, Magdi had an incredibly strong work ethic and drive to succeed.
He just worked all the time, and he would just save, put away the money.
To save some money, he would chew gum for a little bit and put it in his refrigerator so he could chew it later.
And all of that hard work paid off, and he was able to save enough money to buy his family a home in Westminster.
We had a nice little spot over there, a little gated community. My mom would take care of the house. She would always cook for us.
Something smells great.
Oh, there you are, Richard.
Anything to help you, Mom?
Oh, no, I've got it. Sit.
As their sons were becoming more independent, Harriet and Magdy were preparing to enter the next chapter of their lives.
Their oldest son, Richard, was in nursing school, while their youngest, Ryan, was a junior in high school, getting ready to fill out college applications.
Harriet and Magdy were now looking forward to finally being able to take more time for themselves.
But now, the Gerges family is struck with terror after a violent home invasion.
The only family members home at the time were Ryan and Harriet, so Richard and Magdy were spared.
After reluctantly returning home, Ryan calls his family while he waits for the authorities.
Richard, you gotta come home. Hurry!
I got a phone call from Ryan. He sounded very hysterical. I hopped in the car, took off.
It's then that first responders arrive at the home.
Ryan is clearly in distress. He has blood on his face, and he has duct tape wrapped around his neck and his wrist.
You gotta go upstairs and check on my mom, please.
After ensuring that Ryan isn't seriously injured, police officers head inside to check on his mother.
Officers enter the home with weapons drawn, but once inside, it's eerily quiet.
Upon entering the master bedroom, officers make a horrific discovery. Harriet Gerges is in a pool of blood. She's been stabbed to death.
After emigrating from Egypt to the United States, Harriet Gerges had achieved the quintessential American dream with her husband, Magdy.
The couple had 2 sons and built a home for their family in Westminster, California.
But now, police have just found Harriet brutally stabbed to death in their Southern California home.
Harriet wasn't just stabbed to death. She was nearly decapitated.
We're gonna need homicide down here. We'll secure the scene.
Authorities' next objective is to tend to the 911 caller, Harriet's son, 17-year-old Ryan Gerges.
Ryan had several pieces of evidence still on him, including duct tape, so he needed to be processed by our forensics. First, his hands were bagged.
Hey, what's going on? Where's Mom?
As soon as I got home, I could see my little brother, and he had like bags on his hands. And I was like, what's going on? Where's my mom? Where's my mom? They didn't want to answer.
At this point, police don't know who's all involved in the crime.
Please, come with me.
And then they ended up taking me and Ryan to the police station.
Moments later, homicide detectives and CSI arrive on scene to investigate.
When they go into the master bedroom, there's blood everywhere. And the bed next to where Harriet's body is found is filled with stab marks, as though the assailant stabbed her over and over and over again in a vicious rage.
She had been slaughtered.
Faced with the brutality of the crime scene, investigators now wonder, was this a botched robbery or something far more sinister?
Looking through the rest of the house, it doesn't appear that anything has been stolen.
There was nothing taken. There was nothing of value taken, and there was money, and there were other things like jewelry found in the house in plain view.
On top of that, there's no signs of forced entry, and the family lives in a gated community that requires a code just to get in.
To be killed and stabbed in such a violent way sends a different message. Harriet was killed by someone who knew her.
Hoping to get some answers, detectives head back to the station to speak with the Gerges brothers.
They decide to put Ryan and Richard in separate interrogation rooms.
Investigators sit down with Ryan first.
He was the only percipient witness to this and the only person in the house.
Really, at this point, he's the only suspect.
Is my mom doing all right? So, we're going to talk about that in a second, okay?
All right.
Detectives don't waste any time cutting right to the chase.
Did you have a chance to check on your mom before you ran the house?
Nah, I didn't have a chance at all because I was thinking like survival mode.
He was just afraid of what he might find behind the closed bedroom door.
But now, Ryan is ready to clear his name and tell police everything.
It did make me feel uncomfortable by the questions that they were asking, but I was the only other person in the home during that time. I know that they needed to get the story straight, so I felt like I just needed to lay everything out on the table for them.
Ryan says it all began around 3:20 that morning.
I woke up to the door opening. I thought it was my mom or something. And then one of them put their hands over my mouth and they're like, don't say anything. Don't say anything.
What the? Shut up, kid. And then I also felt something like in my mouth, like gloves. So I bit down on the hand.
And then like I jumped up and then like they both like pushed me. And then I fell over.
I got slammed on the floor. My hands were duct taped.
They also wrapped duct tape around his mouth so he couldn't speak.
I noticed that the person that had tied me was taking off his gloves to grab like some shoestrings.
Then they used his shoelaces to wrap around his wrist to reinforce the duct tape.
I was bound at this point, and then I was thrown in the closet.
That's when Harriet, awoken by the commotion, ran into the room.
Oh, please don't hurt my son. You can have anything you want.
When I was in the closet, I was still able to see a little bit.
My mom came and then the guy like put tape over my mom's mouth and everything. And she was resisting, but my mom was like, not. And then I took her somewhere.
He saw his mom being escorted off by the other suspect into her room.
After that, things went quiet.
When I was in the closet, my heart was beating real. I couldn't really hear like every little small thing.
But after a few excruciating moments in the closet, Ryan heard a familiar noise.
He heard footsteps that sounded like they were walking away, and then a car engine starting outside.
I was like, it's either now or never, like, if I'm gonna get out. If I broke free, have the tape off me and all that.
I told myself that I needed to just run to my cell phone right away and then just run out of the house and then call 911.
After Ryan's story, detectives no longer believe he had anything to do with his mom's death. It's obvious he was just another victim.
Although one of the assailants Ryan described wore a mask, he claims to have gotten a closer look at the second attacker's face.
It looked like he was one of those guys that just came out of the pen and stuff and just wanted revenge on someone. Did you recognize him again? Yeah.
Ryan agreed to later sit down with a sketch artist to describe the man's face so they could get a good visual of at least one of the men to start hunting for.
With their suspicions of Ryan dissipated, detectives finally tell him about his mother's demise.
I'm sorry to have to tell you that your mom did pass away. We're obviously going through the process of trying to do everything we can to make sure we find the people that are responsible for this.
I just couldn't believe it, and it was just really tough when I heard that.
In a separate interrogation room, they deliver the tragic news to Ryan's brother Richard as well.
Before we go on, please, I deserve that.
So we have a murder investigation.
Oh, no, she's not. No, she's not. I didn't hear that.
My whole world went in slow motion. I remember I was pretty distraught.
No! No, she's not! She's not!
Richard, take it easy.
No!
For the two young men, it's difficult to wrap their heads around their mother's death.
My mom was a very sweet, loving person, and she went to church a lot, and she didn't have any enemies.
But when detectives ask if there's anyone who could possibly be behind this, Harriet's sons have just one person in mind.
The only person that she had a problem with was my dad.
Police in Westminster, California are speaking with Ryan and Richard Gerges regarding the murder of their loving mother, 55-year-old Harriet Gerges.
She was killed in a pretty brutal fashion.
Harriet had absolutely no enemies. She was beloved in her community. She had a very small circle.
The only person her sons believe might have a motive would be their own father, Magdi Gerges.
The only person that she had a problem with was my dad.
Me and Ryan were just like, he had something to do with it.
The wrinkle in this scenario is that Ryan has shared that it was two black men that were the perpetrators of this crime, but they're wondering if this may now be a murder for hire.
But why would their father want to pay someone to kill his own wife? According to Richard, his parents' relationship wasn't as rosy as it appeared.
Richard says his parents are in a heated divorce. He says that his father even moved out of the house recently, which is why he wasn't there during the attack.
I don't know. We had like the whole situation with my dad. They had like the whole court case going.
That's when Richard tells detectives a story, and it all begins to make sense.
It was around their anniversary time, and he didn't do anything. And she told him, like, hey, you know, like, why don't you take me anywhere? Or like, you know, it's our anniversary, you know, we should be celebrating this. And she was really upset.
You're not listening to me. You never put in any effort anymore.
Oh, here we go again.
Why did I ever marry you? You're so selfish.
In response, Magdi did something that no one, including Harriet, could anticipate.
He got really upset and ended up punching her in the face.
Magdi had actually abused Harriet for years, but it had never been this bad.
I had walked in and I'd seen my mom. She had tears coming down, and I saw my brother. He was like, Dad hit her, Dad hit her.
Oh my God, this has gone too far.
I confronted him. He just told me to like stay out of it. So I ended up taking her to the hospital.
At the hospital, Harriet was diagnosed with a broken nose and a hairline fracture beneath her left eye.
Magdi had physically abused her for years, but this time would be the last time.
She told him that, you know, my dad punched her in the face, and then that got the cops involved.
By the time Harriet and her sons got home, Magdi was on his way out, in handcuffs.
We were all like pretty shocked because we came home and the police were there. When they like put handcuffs on him, I remember him looking at me and he was like, this is because of you.
You did this to me! You'll be sorry, all of you!
Police officers followed up with Harriet and helped her get a protection order against Magdi, which banned Magdi from coming anywhere near her or the family home.
She really like ripped at him, like, you know, like he was abusive to me this whole time. Everything she said was true. She wanted a divorce.
Magdi was obviously infuriated.
Now, he could potentially lose his licensing where he worked at the hospital, and he could be out of a lot of money.
If she prevailed in the divorce, he could lose half his property, including the home that he worked so hard to buy.
Now with Magdi arrested, the family lived in fear of what he would do when he made bail.
He got that like stone cold look in his eyes because we've never really crossed him that way. I was kind of in the bottom of my stomach like, oh shoot, this is like really not good. This guy's gonna retaliate.
Westminster police have just learned that murder victim Harriet Gerges had a very tumultuous relationship with her husband, Magdi.
Magdi had been abusive toward Harriet for years, but after a violent punch to the face, she subsequently pressed charges and filed for divorce.
My dad, he was like really upset. I was kind of in the bottom of my stomach like, oh shoot, this is like really not good. This guy's gonna retaliate.
Magdi made bail after just 5 days behind bars and got himself a new apartment.
My dad was living in Long Beach on a restraining order.
Now, 7 months later, it seems Magdi is the only person with a motive to want Harriet dead.
So they bring Magdi in and ask him if he knows anything about his wife's murder, and his demeanor is very nonchalant.
So is there any reason you could think of why someone would want to break into that house?
Yes, and your guess is better than mine.
He says he has no idea, he doesn't know anything, but detectives were very suspicious of Magdi.
So they decide to just directly confront him with their biggest question.
Did you pay anybody to break into your wife's house?
What kind of question is this, my friend?
That's the question I have to ask.
No, I will never do that.
Magdi denies it. And once it becomes clear that Magdi's not going to confess, investigators have no choice but to let him leave. However, he remains the primary focus of their investigation.
So as soon as Magdi leaves the station, investigators get to work looking for something to connect him to Harriet's murder.
Detectives are able to confirm Magdi's alibi that he was at his apartment in Long Beach during the time of the murder.
We looked to see if there was a large amount of money withdrawn, as well as phone records to see if Magdi had talked to anybody that was out of his normal day-to-day routine, and we were unable to locate anything.
They tried looking for the man in the sketch Ryan helped them draft, but they couldn't find any man who fit the description with a connection to Magdi.
Every direction that detectives looked, the DA looked, they could not find anything tying Magdi to the murder.
Police, they were very optimistic at first, but they were running into a lot of dead ends.
Years pass without any new leads, and Magdi even moves back into the family home.
Ryan and Richard had moved out of the house and they were living with grandparents at that time.
Regardless, Harriet's loved ones aren't giving up the fight for justice.
We'd be calling the police and they're like, nothing new. I kept trying to push to keep it open and to keep things going. The whole department was trying to work on it.
And finally, in 2012, a breakthrough in forensic technology allows for a glimmer of hope.
With the advancement of technology and DNA, there was a chance that DNA evidence could have been left behind.
Ryan mentioned that when one of the intruders was tying a shoestring around his hands, he removed his gloves.
It was very likely that his DNA was transferred to the shoelace.
The detective went ahead and was like, you know what, I'll rerun the DNA evidence and we'll see what we could find.
When they ran that DNA profile through the National DNA Database called CODIS, it belonged to a known gang member and hitman named Anthony Bridget.
Anthony's record shows that he is a career criminal, and he does have gang ties to the Trey 57 Crips gang.
Anthony Bridget had killed in the past. He fit the profile if you were looking to hire a hitman to do this job.
We compared the photo of the sketch made on the night of the homicide with Ryan to that photo of Anthony Bridget, and it was striking how similar the photos were.
He was someone totally opposite from anyone that our family had any ties to or any connections to. It was just mind-blowing.
Anthony had been arrested in 2007 for a parole violation and was currently locked up in California State Prison.
But now that they found Anthony, they're still wondering, did Magdi actually hire him? Or did Anthony have his own motive for the break-in?
Desperate for answers, detectives take a trip down to the prison to meet Anthony Bridget in person.
They're hoping that once they present all of the evidence they have on Anthony, he'll flip on Magdi to save his own skin.
Several of our detectives went up to interview him. Unfortunately, he didn't say much information.
Anthony refuses to give them any intel on Magdi or his mysterious accomplice from the night of the murder.
He's not talking. You know how it is with gang members. Snitches get stitches, right?
With Anthony a dead end, investigators must find another way to get the truth. So they meet with the district attorney's office to come up with a plan.
We decided that it was time to think outside the box.
We came up with an idea. If we posed as a friend of Anthony Bridget, who we knew was involved in the killing, and asked Magdi for more money, then we would confirm that our suspicions were true, that this was a murder for hire.
At that point, only two things could happen. Magdi could call the police and complain he's being harassed by gang members, which is what an innocent man would do, or he could react by paying them off.
Investigators in Westminster, California, are convinced Magdi Gergis is responsible for hiring two men to kill his wife, Harriet. They just need to prove it.
We decided that it was time to think outside the box.
They recruited two police officers from Long Beach who were on gang details, who knew how the Crips dressed and how they talked and how they behaved.
We set up surveillance and made the decision to have them confront Magdi at his home.
As Magdi returns home from a shopping trip on January 30th, 2013, the stage is set.
The undercover officer who's leading the investigation using the pseudonym D Money confronts Magdi.
Check her out, man. My uncle locked up in the pen right now. We approached him about killing a wife too. How? You know what I'm saying? We don't care about the between hands. We want to get paid for it.
Magdi is not sure how to respond, but he doesn't back away. So they said, listen, you need to just give us $5,000.
Magdi doesn't take the bait right away, so the undercover officers put their phone number on a piece of paper and tell him to call them the next day about the payment.
Give me a call. Just hung up. Just give me a call tomorrow about 5,000. Pick me up tomorrow.
This was all recorded on video, taking the piece of paper with the phone number. And now we had to sit and wait.
The next morning, investigators are anxious to see what Magdi does with the phone number.
Now, if he's innocent, he should call the police right away and report what happened to him.
But the next day, he went into the city of Long Beach and stopped at a payphone.
It looks like he's talking to somebody right now. Look at it on his phone.
When Magdi makes his call, it's to none other than D Money.
And we were able to not only watch Magdi make the phone call from the payphone, but listen in through the wire of the undercover officer.
Magdi manages to call, and then all the confirmation we were waiting for was spoken. He said, I already paid.
Problem is, my boy's locked down in the pen like I told you yesterday, so, we just trying to get paid just to keep it hush. You know what I mean?
I told you got paid over the day.
This is the first time that Magdi has admitted to making any type of payment in connection with his wife's murder.
Now we knew we were right.
As the undercover officer plays along, Magdi shows his true colors.
We got paid everything, but they pushing up on my boy, man. 5,000 ain't that much, man.
I don't have it. That's the problem. 1,500 I have on me.
Magdi once again showed what was most important to him, which was money, and began trying to negotiate down the $5,000.
It was a great moment. Then, just as quickly as that moment came, we were back to the nail biting. Because the next thing he did was asked who the middleman was.
This was new information to us. We were unaware of a middleman.
For a moment, they wonder if everything is about to blow up in their faces.
Fortunately for us, our undercover officer was quick to think on his feet.
Everybody know who the middleman was. I ain't worried about that. The information that I got, player, I can go to police. But I'm not. I'm just trying to get my money so I can go.
Magdi doesn't push the question again.
Once we had the confirmation that this was a murder for hire and there was a middleman involved, the next step would be the exchange for what we considered to be hush money.
You gonna bring 1,500?
Okay. All right.
All right, I'll see you tomorrow.
1 o'clock.
1 o'clock.
Bye.
Now the last question, will he actually pay up?
The next day, an entire team of undercover officers meet at the location to wait for Magdi.
We weren't sure if he was getting cold feet to go to the meet or not.
Eventually, Magdi shows up and the undercover officers go over to meet him. And they chat for only a moment before things get real.
Magdi never got out of his vehicle, but he did do a money exchange.
And as Magdi hands over the $1,500 cash, Westminster's undercover officer has one last question to ask him.
He had asked Magdi what his wife did that was so bad to have her murdered.
But he didn't take the bait.
Then he tried to drive away.
Okay, he's driving off. Not sure what happened.
For nearly a decade, Magdi Gergis has been the prime suspect in the murder of his wife, Harriet. And now California investigators have launched a sting operation in an attempt to finally take him down.
So Magdi shows up to meet who he believes are gang members, but are actually undercover cops. And he hands them $1,500.
Our undercover officer had asked Magdi what his wife did that was so bad to have her murdered. Magdi didn't bite. He tried to drive away.
Okay, he's driving off. Not sure what happened.
They didn't need his answer. They still had more than enough evidence against him to take him down.
Long Beach is taking the takedown. Long Beach is doing the takedown. Stand by.
When they made an arrest on my dad, I mean, it was like a bittersweet moment because it's like, you know, my father getting arrested, but at the same time, I felt like wow, like we finally are about to get some justice.
Back at the station, detectives put Magdi in an interrogation room, and he immediately plays the victim.
He becomes very agitated, crying.
My wife problem is not solved yet. And we consider the husband as a suspect.
You know why I know why you're suspect. You paid somebody to do this, and we know you paid them.
Detectives here are pushing for a confession, or at least for Magdi to realize that he has incriminated himself.
I'm not hired anybody. We recorded it. No.
There's an old saying, even the dumbest fish won't get caught if he keeps his mouth shut. And this man did. He maintained that sort of silence throughout.
To try to squeeze a confession out of him, the Westminster police think outside the box once again. They bring in their secret weapon, Magdi's son, Ryan Gergis.
We believe that by utilizing Ryan as an interview tactic to confront his father, that maybe his father would break down and give us information.
Both boys had not been speaking to their father since the death of their mother. They had moved out of the house.
I'll step outside for privacy. Is that you? What's wrong with you? You forgot that? You don't even look the same. You don't look like the same person at all.
And that's actually the first time that I confronted my dad about everything. And I sat there and I drilled him. I told him, like, how can you do this to our family? And I can't believe it. And he just opened up with like a sob story.
How can you still live in the same house that a murder had taken place in? How can you... It's not easy, but I have no other choice. What are you talking about? You have different choices in your life. You had a choice not to hurt me and Richard. You had a choice not to hurt your wife.
Unfortunately, he just sat there and denied everything and said he had nothing to do with it.
I was loving you, caring for you, believe. No, you did not care for me. Okay, I can die now, and I know that my son doesn't want to see me. Thank you. It's okay, my son. You're gonna be my son forever, in my heart, okay? Can't do this no more. Thank you.
I did walk away because I felt like my blood was boiling, but I just felt like I just got something off of my chest that day.
Even without a confession, police have enough evidence to charge Magdi Gergis with capital murder. And finally, 10 years after Harriet Gergis's murder, Magdi's trial begins in the spring of 2014.
The prosecution team paints Magdi as somebody who was focused on accumulating financial wealth, was selfish, and was an abuser.
Harriet's domestic violence case against Magdi Gergis was one of the primary motives for why she was killed. He would lose his license if he was convicted of a felony at that time. So it was very important that that case go away. In addition to that, there was all of the divorce issues.
He was very frugal, and he knew that if they would have divorced, my dad would have probably had to pay alimony.
So prosecutors believed Magdi came up with a plan. He would eliminate his wife before she could ruin his reputation and take his precious money.
Prosecutors believe that Magdi went through some type of middleman to hire two men to kill his wife.
They're certain one of the men was Anthony Bridget, but the identities of the second killer and the middleman are still a mystery.
Magdi gave them the code to the community gates and gave them a spare key to unlock the door.
Then in September 29, 2004, two men entered the home and tied up the younger son, Ryan, so that he was out of the way.
With Ryan tied up in the closet, the assailants carried out their deadly mission.
They turned their attention to Harriet.
They believe the other suspect was the one who actually killed Harriet.
He stabbed her over and over again. This is the most horrific violence.
Harriet's life was stolen at the very moment she tried to reclaim it. And that is the real tragedy.
Yo, let's go. Come on.
After that, the killers fled and remained anonymous for years. It almost looked like Magdi would get away with it. But thanks to breakthroughs in DNA science, police were able to hone in on Anthony Bridget and, by extension, Magdi.
Then prosecutors revealed their most damning evidence: the footage of Magdi paying hush money to the undercover officers.
His evidence of guilt is all in his state of mind and that intent to kill and the actions he did to make sure that happened and to make sure that stayed quiet. But it's not as if you have someone with a smoking gun for the jury to say, well, this is the person who did it.
And on April 17th, 2013, the decision is left for the jury to decide.
Ultimately, they found Magdi Gergis guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder.
Magdi was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
When it's Anthony's turn in court, he's found guilty of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and is sentenced to life without parole.
For Richard and Ryan Gergis, finally seeing their father behind bars is a relief after 10 long years of seeking justice. But unfortunately, it's not the end.
The person who actually slayed Harriet Gergis is still out there, and so is the so-called middleman.
It was a little sad when it wasn't everybody, but at the same time, I thank God that we ended up getting the justice that we got.
As long as they're still free, me and Richard are still working hard to get the story out to everyone that could definitely help with the capture. If you have any information, please come forward to the Westminster Police Department.
While Harriet's absence has been a painful burden for her sons to bear, her memory reminds them of how to move forward.
She helped really teach me how to love and be affectionate towards others and be compassionate towards others.
Me and Richard have never, ever, ever went a day without remembering everything that she's done for us. She always thought about her kids and her family number one, no matter what.
There are murders that shock a city for a few days, murders that dominate the newspapers, fill television screens, and then slowly disappear beneath the next headline. And then there are murders that refuse to disappear. They remain in the streets where they happened. They remain in the memories of the people who knew the victim. They remain in police files, evidence boxes, unanswered questions, and in the mind of anyone who ever wondered how a killer could walk away while a young woman's life was cut brutally short. On the night of July 7th, still 1993, Seattle was about to become the center of one of those cases. Mia Zapata was 27 years old. She was a musician, a performer, and a familiar figure within Seattle's underground music scene. She was the lead singer of the GITs, a band that had built a devoted following through raw energy, relentless performances, and a sound that seemed perfectly suited to the restless atmosphere of early 1990s Seattle. The city was changing rapidly. Grunge had transformed Seattle from a distant Pacific Northwest city into an international center of alternative music. But beneath the fame, beneath the clubs, record stores, rehearsal spaces, and crowded streets, Seattle was still a city where people knew each other through music, friendship, and small communities. Mia was part of that world. Her friends knew her as fiercely independent, energetic, funny, and determined. She had built a life around music. She had moved to Seattle from Louisville, Kentucky, and had become deeply connected to the GITs and the city's music community. Her voice was unmistakable. Her presence was powerful, and to the people around her, she seemed to be exactly where she wanted to be. Then, on that July night, everything changed. Mia had spent the evening with friends. At some point, she left. The details surrounding her final hours would later become crucial because investigators would have to reconstruct a timeline from fragments, memories, and physical evidence. What happened next was violent and horrifying. Mia was attacked. She was beaten and sexually assaulted. She was strangled. Her body was discovered in the early hours of July 7th in Seattle's Central District inside a parked vehicle. The scene immediately raised questions. Who had attacked her? Why had she been targeted? Was the killer someone she knew? Had she been followed? Was the attack random? And most importantly, how could someone commit such a brutal crime and then disappear into the city? The investigation began with urgency. Detectives examined the vehicle. They looked for fingerprints, fibers, biological evidence, witnesses, and anything else that might explain what had happened. Mia's death was not simply another homicide. She belonged to a tight-knit music community, and the impact was immediate. Friends were devastated. Musicians were stunned. People who had seen Mia perform struggled to understand how someone so alive and visible could suddenly be gone. The GITS had been gaining momentum, and Mia's future seemed full of possibilities. Now her friends were standing in the aftermath of a murder that seemed impossible to comprehend. Investigators had a crime scene, but they did not have a name. They had evidence, but they did not have a suspect. They had questions, but very few answers. The first challenge was reconstructing Mia's movements. Every conversation mattered. Every person who had seen her that night mattered. Every vehicle passing through the area might have mattered. Detectives needed to know where she had been, who she had been with, and whether anyone had noticed something unusual. The investigation generated leads, and detectives pursued them. But the case did not produce the immediate breakthrough they needed. There was no obvious suspect who could be placed at the scene. No confession came forward. No witness could definitively identify the attack. The killer had left behind something far more important than investigators initially realized: biological evidence. At the time, DNA technology was still developing. DNA profiling had already begun transforming criminal investigations, but forensic laboratories did not possess the speed, databases, or technological capabilities that would become available years later. Evidence could be collected and preserved, but connecting that evidence to a specific person was another matter entirely. This distinction would become central to Mia Zapata's case. Investigators could potentially know that biological material belonged to the perpetrator. What they could not immediately determine was whose biological material it was. That meant the evidence could sit inside the investigation like a locked door, waiting for the right key. Meanwhile, The search continued. Detectives examined Mia's relationships. They considered people she knew and people she did not. They looked at possible motives and possible opportunities. But as weeks became months, the investigation struggled to identify the person responsible. For Mia's friends, the uncertainty was unbearable. They were not simply mourning someone who had died. They were living with the knowledge that the person who killed her remained free. Every time they walked through Seattle, every time they entered a club, every time they saw a stranger behaving strangely, the same question could return. Could that be him? The city itself became part of the mystery. Seattle's streets, once associated with music and creativity, now carried another memory. Mia's murder became a wound in the community. Her friends wanted justice, but justice required a suspect. And a suspect required a breakthrough. Years passed. The music scene changed. The early 1990s explosion of grunge faded into history. Bands came and went. People moved away. Careers changed. Lives continued. But Mia Zapata's murder remained unsolved. The case became what investigators call a cold case, a crime in which the initial investigative momentum has stalled but the evidence remains. Cold cases can be deceptive. They appear dormant, but they are never truly dead. Evidence can survive. Memories can resurface. Technology can advance. A database can expand. A forensic technique can become more sensitive, and sometimes, decades after a murder, something that seemed meaningless suddenly becomes decisive. In Mia's case, that possibility depended on the evidence preserved from the original investigation. Detectives had not forgotten her. Her friends had not forgotten her. And the people who had loved her refused to let her murder become just another unsolved file. The GITs continued to exist in memory, their music becoming inseparable from the story of the woman whose life had been violently taken. Mia's voice remained on recordings. Her photographs remained. Her friends remembered her laughter, her intensity, her presence on stage. But there was another presence that haunted the case, the unknown man responsible for her death. For years, investigators did not know his name. They did not know where he lived. They did not know whether he was still in Seattle or had disappeared somewhere else. They did not know whether he had ever confessed to anyone. They did not know whether he had followed the case in the newspapers. They did not know whether he understood that the evidence he had left behind might eventually expose him. What investigators did know was that Mia had not simply vanished. Her killer had left evidence, and evidence does not forget. It waits. In the years after the murder, forensic science advanced dramatically. DNA analysis became more powerful. Law enforcement databases expanded. Investigators gained new tools for comparing biological evidence with profiles from people arrested or convicted of other crimes. What had once been an unidentified biological sample could eventually become a name. The question was no longer simply whether evidence existed. The question was whether science had finally become capable of reading it. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, investigators were looking again at cold cases that had once seemed impossible to solve. Mia Zapata's case was among them. The evidence collected in 1993 had not disappeared. It had remained available for new testing, and eventually, investigators would obtain the breakthrough they had been waiting for. But before that moment arrived, the case had already endured almost a decade of uncertainty, almost a decade in which Mia's family and friends had no answer, almost a decade in which her killer had not been publicly identified. Almost a decade in which a young woman's murder remained one of Seattle's most haunting unsolved crimes. Then came a development that changed everything. Investigators connected DNA evidence from the crime to a man whose name had not been part of the original investigation. His name was Jesus Mezquia. He was a Cuban national living in Florida. The connection was not made because detectives suddenly discovered a forgotten witness who knew him. It was not the result of a dramatic confession. It was forensic science. DNA evidence from the murder was compared with a DNA profile associated with Mezquia, and the match gave investigators what they had lacked for years: a direct scientific link between a living suspect and the evidence recovered from Mia Zapata's murder. The cold case was no longer simply a mystery. It had a direction. A name had emerged from the evidence, and after nearly a decade of silence, investigators finally had a path toward the man they believed was responsible for Mia's death. For the people who had spent years asking whether her killer would ever be found, the development was extraordinary. The case that had seemed frozen in 1993 was suddenly moving again, but finding a DNA match was only the beginning. Investigators still had to establish what happened, where Mezquia had been, how he could have encountered me, and whether the evidence could withstand the scrutiny of a courtroom. The murder had happened years earlier. Memories had faded. People had moved. The city had changed, yet the evidence remained. And that evidence was now pointing toward a suspect. Somewhere between the streets of Seattle in 1993 and a forensic laboratory almost a decade later, the silence surrounding Mia Zapata's murder had finally begun to break. The woman whose life ended on a dark Seattle night had not been forgotten. Her case had survived the years. And now, after nearly 10 years of uncertainty, investigators were standing at the threshold of an answer. The name was Jesus Mezquia. The evidence was DNA. And the question that had haunted Seattle since July 1993 was finally moving toward the courtroom. Was this the man who had taken Mia Zapata's life? The name Jesus Mezquia had changed the direction of the investigation, but a DNA match was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a confrontation between evidence collected in 1993 and a suspect who had lived 4 years without being publicly identified as Mia Zapata's killer. Nearly a decade had passed since the night Mia was murdered, and during those years, the original investigation had traveled through uncertainty, dead ends, unanswered questions, and the slow passage of time. Now detectives had something they had never possessed before: a forensic connection. The biological evidence recovered from the crime scene pointed toward Mezquia, a Cuban national living in Florida. Investigators had to determine exactly how that connection had been established and whether it could withstand the legal scrutiny that would follow. For a case that had remained unsolved for so long, there was no room for assumptions. The evidence had to speak for itself. The DNA profile became the central bridge between the crime scene and the suspect. In 1993, when Mia's body was discovered in Seattle, DNA technology had been available but was nowhere near as powerful or widely integrated into investigations as it would become during the following decade. The biological material collected from a violent crime could be preserved, but investigators might have no way to identify the person who left it behind. That was the problem Mia's case faced. The evidence existed. The identity did not. Years later, advances in forensic testing made it possible to revisit that evidence with greater precision. The case was no longer dependent solely on eyewitnesses or memories. The physical evidence had survived, and when investigators were able to compare it with a DNA profile connected to Mezquia, the cold case suddenly had a suspect. For the detectives involved, the significance was enormous. For Mia's friends, it was deeply emotional. They had waited years for the possibility that the person responsible would be identified. Some had watched the case become a permanent part of Seattle's history. Others had continued to speak about Mia, keeping her name alive through music, memorials, and remembrance. Now there was a man at the center of the investigation. But the years between 1993 and the DNA breakthrough could not simply be erased. Investigators still had to reconstruct the circumstances surrounding Mia's death and determine how Mezquia could have crossed paths with her. The original crime scene remained critical. Mia had been found inside a vehicle in Seattle's Central District after being attacked, beaten, sexually assaulted, and strangled. The physical violence indicated that the crime had been brutal, but the motive remained uncertain. There was no simple explanation that could answer every question. Why Mia? Why that night? Why that location? Was the encounter planned? Or had it begun as something apparently ordinary and turned into violence? Those questions became even more important once investigators believed they knew who had left the biological evidence behind. A suspect's identity could explain who had been present, but it did not automatically explain every detail of the crime. Detectives needed to establish a chain of evidence connecting Mezquia to Mia, the crime scene, and the circumstances of the murder. This is where cold cases become especially difficult. A modern investigation can begin with a suspect and work backward, but a case from years earlier must reconstruct events from fragments. People remember differently. Records may be incomplete. Witnesses may have moved or died. Physical locations can change, yet the original evidence can remain remarkably powerful when properly preserved. In Mia's case, that evidence had waited through years when the investigation seemed unable to move forward. The DNA breakthrough demonstrated why preserving evidence matters. A biological sample that could not identify a killer in 1993 could become decisive years later. Science had changed, but the evidence had not. The investigation now moved from the question of who could have committed the crime to whether the evidence could establish that Mezquia was the man responsible. Investigators learned more about Mezquia's background. He had lived in Florida, far from the Seattle streets where Mia was killed. That distance added another layer to the case. If the DNA linked him to the crime, how had he ended up in Seattle in 1993? Was he there at the time? Did investigators know his whereabouts? Had his name ever appeared in the original investigation? The answer to these questions mattered because prosecutors would eventually need to present a coherent narrative to a jury. A DNA profile could be powerful evidence, but a courtroom requires more than a dramatic revelation. It requires admissible evidence, scientific explanation, and a clear connection between the evidence and the accused. The investigation therefore continued. Detectives examined the circumstances surrounding Mezquia and the information available about his presence in the Pacific Northwest. They reviewed the original case file. They revisited evidence. They considered the timeline, and gradually the case that had once seemed frozen began to take shape again. For Seattle, the development reopened an old wound. Mia's murder had become closely associated with the city's music community. She was not remembered simply as the victim of an unsolved homicide. She was remembered as Mia, the singer whose voice had electrified small clubs and whose life had been intertwined with a musical movement that would later become famous around the world. Her death had already devastated the people closest to her. Now the possibility of justice brought another wave of attention. The public wanted answers. The media wanted to understand how a killer could remain unidentified for so long, and investigators faced the difficult responsibility of moving forward without compromising the case. The DNA evidence was the turning point because it transformed an unknown perpetrator into an identifiable suspect. But the emotional weight of that discovery was complicated. Nearly 10 years had passed. Nothing could bring Min back. Nothing could restore the future she should have had. The only thing investigators could offer her family and friends was the possibility of accountability. That possibility depended on the court. Mezquia eventually became the focus of the prosecution, and the case moved toward trial in Washington state. The evidence would be examined under the highest standard required in a criminal courtroom. The defense would have an opportunity to challenge the prosecution's case. The DNA evidence would have to be explained. The circumstances of the murder would have to be reconstructed. And the jury would have to decide whether the evidence established Mezquia's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. For a case that had begun in the darkness of a Seattle night, the next stage would unfold under courtroom light. But before that happened, investigators and prosecutors had to confront one of the central mysteries of the case: the years of separation between the crime and the suspect's identification. The question was not only why the killer had remained unidentified, it was also why the case had required nearly a decade before science could provide the breakthrough. The answer reflected the limits of forensic technology in the early 1990s. DNA testing was revolutionary, but it was not yet the universal investigative tool it would become. Databases were smaller. Processing could be slow. Profiles could not always be compared against broad populations of known offenders. A sample could prove that a biological material belonged to one person without immediately telling investigators who that person was. That distinction is critical to understanding Mia Zapata's case. The evidence did not suddenly appear years later. It had been there. What changed was the ability to use it. This is one of the most important realities of cold case investigations. Time does not necessarily destroy every clue. Sometimes time gives science the opportunity to understand clues that investigators could not fully exploit when the crime occurred. In Mia's case, the technology eventually turned biological evidence into an identity. That identity led investigators to Jesus Mezquia, and that connection became the foundation of the prosecution. But for Mia's friends, the scientific breakthrough carried another meaning. It meant the person they had spent years imagining as an unknown shadow now had a face and a name. For years, the killer had existed in the abstract. He was simply the person who murdered Mia. Now there was a specific individual accused of committing that crime. The emotional transition was difficult. Anger replaced uncertainty. Questions became sharper. The community began to ask what justice would look like after so much time. The case also demonstrated how deeply Mia's murder had affected Seattle's music scene. Her death had become a symbol of vulnerability within a community that had often imagined itself as separate from the violence and pressures of the outside world. The murder shattered that sense of security. Friends had to confront the reality that someone could be attacked and killed in the middle of the city, leaving behind a community that would spend years demanding answers. When the suspect was finally identified, the story changed again. The mystery had become a prosecution. But the road to conviction was not guaranteed. Cold case prosecutions are complicated because the passage of time can create uncertainty, witness memories may be questioned, physical evidence must be carefully documented. Investigators who work the original case may have to explain decisions made years earlier. Prosecutors must show that the evidence has been preserved properly and that the scientific conclusions are reliable. The defense can challenge the chain of custody, the interpretation of DNA, the circumstances surrounding the collection of evidence, and every other part of the prosecution's narrative. The burden remains on the state. The accusation is not the verdict. The DNA connection was powerful, but the courtroom would determine what that evidence ultimately meant. As the case advanced, the years of waiting suddenly became part of the story. Mia's murder had happened in 1993. Nearly a decade later, investigators finally had the man they believed responsible. But for those who had spent those years without answers, the delay was more than a statistic. It was a period of birthdays Mia never experienced, songs she never performed, friendships that continued without her, and a city that moved forward while one question remained frozen in time. Now that question had been reopened. The investigation had moved from a crime scene in Seattle to forensic laboratories, from biological evidence to a suspect, and from an unsolved file toward a courtroom. But the most difficult question remained. Could the evidence prove that Jesus Ezq was not merely connected to Mia Zapata's murder, but was the man who committed it? The answer would depend on what investigators had preserved, what forensic science could demonstrate, and what prosecutors could prove. The case had survived almost 10 years. The evidence had survived with it. And as the prosecution prepared to present its case, Mia's story was about to move from the pages of an unsolved investigation into the public record of a courtroom where every piece of evidence would be tested and where, finally, the question of responsibility would have to be answered. For nearly 10 years, the question surrounding Mia Zapata's murder had been brutally simple and impossibly difficult at the same time. Who killed her? Now investigators believed they had an answer, but identifying a suspect and proving a murder are two very different things. The DNA evidence had brought Jesus Mezquia into the case, yet prosecutors still had to reconstruct a crime that had happened in Seattle in 1993, more than a decade before a jury would eventually hear the evidence. The passage of time had not erased the murder, it had made every detail more important. In the courtroom, the prosecution would have to take fragments from that long-ago night and connect them into a story that could withstand challenge after challenge. The defense would be watching every step. The jury would be listening for uncertainty. And at the center of everything was the biological evidence recovered from Mia's body. That evidence had survived years in storage. It had survived the limits of 1990s forensic technology, and eventually it had pointed investigators toward a man living thousands of miles from Seattle. The breakthrough had begun with something almost invisible. Investigators knew that biological material had been recovered from bite marks on Mia's body. Those marks had been documented during the original examination, and samples were preserved. At the time, however, the technology available to investigators could not turn those samples into a usable identification. Years later, the evidence was reconsidered. Washington State forensic scientists were able to develop a male DNA profile from the biological material. The profile was entered into a national database. Then came the result that changed the case. In December 2002, the database produced a match to Jesus Mezquii, a Cuban-born fisherman living in the Florida Keys. The discovery stunned investigators because Mezquii was not someone they had spent the previous decade publicly identifying as a suspect. He was not a name that had dominated the original investigation. He was a man whose identity emerged from science. That was what made the breakthrough so powerful. The investigators had not simply selected a person and searched for evidence against him. They had evidence first, and the evidence led them to him. But the connection created another problem. Mezquii was living in Florida. Mia had been murdered in Seattle. Prosecutors would need to show that he had actually been in Seattle around the time of the murder. A DNA match could indicate that his biological material was present, but the investigation still needed to establish opportunity. Detectives began digging through records from the early 1990s. They searched for traces of Mezquia's presence in Washington State. Old records suddenly mattered. Arrest records mattered. Traffic citations mattered. Documents that might have seemed insignificant years earlier became pieces of a timeline. Investigators were trying to answer one critical question. Could Jesus Mezquii have been in Seattle when Mia Zapata was killed? Their research produced evidence that placed him in the area around the time of the murder. The distance between the suspect and the crime scene was no longer an insurmountable obstacle. The investigation had a suspect, a DNA connection, and evidence that he had been in Seattle. The case was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Yet investigators still had to confront the possibility that the defense would offer another explanation. DNA can tell investigators that biological material is associated with a person, but the courtroom question is always more complicated. How did it get there? Why was it there? What circumstances explain the contact? And what does the totality of evidence demonstrate? Those questions would eventually become central to the trial. In January 2003, Seattle police traveled to Florida to confront Mezquii. The moment was extraordinary for the detectives who had spent years trying to identify Mia's killer. For almost a decade, the perpetrator had been an unknown figure. Now, investigators were face to face with a man whose DNA had been connected to the evidence from the murder. They needed to hear his explanation. They needed to observe his reaction, and they needed to determine whether his story could survive the forensic evidence. During questioning, investigators presented Mezquii with photographs connected to several cases. He denied knowing the victims, including Mia, but detectives already possessed information that made his denial particularly significant. His DNA had been associated with evidence from Mia's body. According to investigators, the contradiction between his statement and the forensic evidence became a critical part of the interrogation. Eventually, Mezquii was arrested and brought back to Washington. The arrest sent shockwaves through Seattle for years. People had lived with the idea that Mia's killer might never be found. Suddenly, there was a name. There was a suspect. There was a path toward prosecution. For Mia's father, Dick Zapata, the news was overwhelming. Investigators had called him with the extraordinary announcement that they believed they had found the man responsible for his daughter's murder. The family had spent years waiting for that phone call. Now it had finally come, but even then, nothing was guaranteed. An arrest is an accusation, not a conviction. The prosecution still had to prove its case, and the defense would challenge the government's interpretation of the evidence. The legal process would become the next battlefield. The prosecution charged Mezquii IA with first-degree murder. The case centered on the killing of Mia Zapata, a 27-year-old musician whose murder had remained unsolved for more than a decade. Prosecutors argued that the DNA evidence was the key that finally unlocked the investigation. They emphasized that the biological evidence was not simply found somewhere near Mia. It came from evidence associated directly with her body. The significance of that distinction would be enormous. The defense, however, argued that the DNA did not by itself establish that Mezquia had committed the murder. That argument would force the prosecution to provide more than a laboratory result. The jury would need to understand the circumstances surrounding the evidence and why the prosecution believed the DNA connection was proof of guilt rather than an unexplained coincidence. The trial began in March 2004 at King County Superior Court in Seattle. By then, the murder had become one of the city's most enduring mysteries. Friends and family members who had spent years wondering what happened to Mia were now sitting inside a courtroom watching the man accused of killing her. Many of them had never seen Jesus Mezquia before. His appearance in court transformed the abstract idea of Mia's killer into a physical presence. For years, the unknown perpetrator had existed only in questions. Now he was sitting at the defense table. The prosecution presented the case as the culmination of years of investigative work. Deputy Prosecutor Tim Bradshaw told jurors that the key to the case had been invisible. The phrase captured the strange reality of cold case investigation. Investigators had worked the case. They had followed leads. The music community had raised money for private investigators. People had tried to generate information, yet the breakthrough had come from something that could not be seen with the naked eye. DNA. A biological trace left behind during the attack had survived long enough for science to identify the person who left it. The courtroom, therefore, became a place where technology and old-fashioned detective work collided. The jury heard about the original investigation. They heard about Mia's final hours. They heard about the physical evidence. They heard about the DNA testing. And they heard about the process that led investigators from a sample stored for years to a man living in Florida. The defense attempted to weaken the prosecution's interpretation. The fact that Mezquia's DNA was present did not, according to the defense, automatically establish that he was the person who murdered Mia. The prosecution had to demonstrate the meaning of the evidence within the larger circumstances. That was the challenge. The jury was not being asked to decide whether a DNA match was interesting. They were being asked to decide whether the evidence proved murder beyond a reasonable doubt. Outside the courtroom, the case remained intensely emotional. Mia's friends and fellow musicians had spent years keeping her memory alive. The Seattle music community had never fully accepted that her murder might remain unsolved forever. The GITS had become part of the city's musical history, and Mia's absence had become inseparable from that history. Her voice continued to exist through recordings, but the woman behind that voice was gone. Every day of the trial, therefore, carried a painful contradiction. Justice might finally be possible, but justice could never restore what had been taken. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution continued building its case. The evidence connected Mezquia to Mia. Investigators had placed him in Seattle. The DNA evidence had emerged from material recovered during the original investigation. The timeline was becoming clearer. The unknown killer who had disappeared into the chaos of 1993 now stood accused more than 10 years later. But the jury had not yet spoken, and that silence mattered. Trials can turn on a single piece of evidence, but they can also turn on the cumulative weight of many pieces. A jury must consider the entire picture. The prosecution believed the picture was clear. The defense insisted that reasonable doubt remained. Every argument, every forensic explanation, every piece of testimony was another attempt to shape how the jury would understand a crime that had happened so long ago. The trial lasted roughly 2 weeks. Then the arguments ended, and the jury was sent away to deliberate. For Mia's family and friends, this was perhaps the most difficult stage of all. They had waited more than a decade for this moment. Now the decision was no longer in the hands of detectives or forensic scientists. It was in the hands of 12 jurors. More than 2 full days passed. The delay created anxiety inside the courtroom. A quick verdict might have seemed reassuring, but the longer the deliberations continued, the more uncertainty grew. Had the jury reached an impasse? Were there disagreements? Was someone unconvinced? For investigators who had worked so hard to bring the case to trial, the possibility of a hung jury was frightening. The entire prosecution had been built around a murder that had remained unresolved for years. A failure to reach a verdict could have reopened the uncertainty all over again. Then, after more than 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned. The courtroom became still. Everyone waited for the words that would determine whether the cold case had truly been solved. The verdict was guilty. Jesus Mezquii was convicted of first-degree felony murder in connection with Mia Zapata's rape and strangulation death. The reaction inside and outside the courtroom was immediate. Mia's loved ones embraced one another. Tears came. There were cries of relief. People who had spent years carrying grief and uncertainty finally had a legal answer. The verdict could not change July 7th. Still, 1993. It could not erase the violence. It could not give Mia back the years she had lost, but it established accountability. The unknown killer now had a name, and the name had been attached to a conviction. For Seattle's music community, the verdict closed, one chapter of a nightmare that had lasted more than a decade. But the story did not end when the jury said guilty. The legal process would continue. Mezquii would be sentenced, and the sentence itself would later become the subject of an appeal. The conviction would survive that appeal, while the original sentence would be overturned because of a legal issue involving the length of the punishment. The case therefore continued to move through the courts even after the jury had delivered its verdict. Yet the central mystery had finally been answered. The biological evidence preserved from 1993 had outlasted the limitations of the technology available at the time. It had crossed a decade of uncertainty and eventually pointed investigators toward Jesus Mezquii. A trace that had once been invisible had become the most important clue in the case. And for Mia Zapata's family, that evidence had accomplished something the investigation could not achieve for years. It had turned a question into an answer. More than 10 years after Mia's death, the person convicted of killing her was standing before the court. The city that had spent years asking who murdered the young singer finally knew. The cold case was no longer cold. It had been solved by evidence that had been waiting in silence all along. The guilty verdict answered the question that had haunted Seattle for more than a decade, but it did not erase the years of uncertainty that had come before it, and it did not bring Mia Zapata back to the people who had loved her. On the night of July 7th, still 1993, Mia had been 27 years old, a musician building a life in Seattle and the lead singer of the GITS, a band deeply connected to the city's underground music community. By the time Jesus Mezquii was convicted in 2004, Mia had been gone for more than 10 years. The distance between those two moments was difficult to comprehend. A young woman had been murdered. Her friends had searched for answers. Detectives had followed leads. Evidence had been collected and preserved, and still, for years, there had been no name attached to the crime. Then, forensic science changed the equation. The DNA evidence eventually led investigators to Mezquii, and the prosecution built its case around that connection and other evidence placing him in Seattle around the time of the murder. But the verdict was not simply the conclusion of a courtroom proceeding. It was the culmination of an investigation that had demonstrated how a case could remain alive even when every traditional lead appeared to have failed. For Mia's family, the conviction carried an emotion that was difficult to describe. There was relief, but there was also grief. Justice does not reverse time. It does not restore the person who was taken. It does not give a family back the birthdays, conversations, performances, and ordinary moments that disappeared with a loved one. The verdict could only establish responsibility for the crime. The rest of the loss remained permanent. The story of Mia Zapata had begun long before the murder. She had grown up in Louisville, Kentucky, and eventually made her way to Seattle, where she became part of a creative community that would later become famous for its music. The GITS had formed around musicians who brought a distinctive intensity to their performances, and Mia became known for a voice that was forceful, emotional, and impossible to ignore. Her death, therefore, struck more than one family. It struck a network of musicians, friends, fans, and people who had known her through Seattle's clubs and neighborhoods. Her murder became one of the city's most painful, unresolved crimes. As the years passed, the question of whether the case would ever be solved became part of Mia's legacy. People continued to talk about her. Her music continued to circulate. Her friends continued to remember the person behind the headlines. And while investigators kept the case alive, the world around it changed. Seattle changed. The music industry changed. Technology changed. DNA changed. That last transformation was critical. When Mia was murdered in 1993, forensic DNA analysis was still relatively new. Investigators could collect biological evidence, but identifying an unknown offender from that evidence was not always possible. The technology needed to extract, interpret, compare, and search DNA profiles continued to advance. Eventually, the biological evidence associated with Mia's murder produced a male DNA profile. That profile was searched through law enforcement databases, and the search led investigators to Jesus MEZQUIS. The breakthrough was extraordinary precisely because it did not depend on someone suddenly remembering the killer's fate. It did not depend on a witness appearing after years of silence. It came from evidence that had been present from the beginning. The technology had simply caught up with the evidence. This is what makes cold cases so different from ordinary investigations. A case can appear dormant while the physical evidence remains active. A fingerprint can wait. A photograph can wait. A biological sample can wait. A document can wait. What seems like an insignificant trace in one decade can become decisive in another. Mia's case became an example of that principle. The DNA did not tell investigators the entire story of the murder. It gave them a path. That path led to MEZQUII, and once investigators had a suspect, they could begin reconstructing the circumstances surrounding him. His presence in the Seattle area became an important part of the prosecution's case. Investigators had to establish that the DNA connection was not an isolated scientific curiosity, but part of a broader evidentiary picture. In court, the prosecution presented the DNA evidence alongside evidence concerning Mesquia's presence in Seattle. The defense challenged the state's interpretation of the evidence, as it had every right to do. The jury was required to consider whether the prosecution had proved guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. After deliberating for more than 2 days, the jurors returned a guilty verdict. The decision brought a formal end to the central question of who was responsible for Mia's death. MEZQUII was convicted of first-degree felony murder in connection with the rape and strangulation of Mia Zapata. He received a sentence of 37 years in prison. For those who had followed the case, the number represented more than punishment. It represented a legal acknowledgement that Mia's life had been taken by violence and that the person responsible had been held accountable. Yet the legal aftermath was not completely finished. MEZQUII appealed, and in 2006, the Washington State Court of Appeals overturned the original sentence because of an issue involving the calculation of the sentence. The conviction itself remained intact. The court's decision did not erase the jury's finding that MEZQUII was guilty. Instead, it required the sentencing process to be corrected. The distinction mattered. The murder conviction survived. The legal system had confirmed the central result of the trial, while the sentence was revisited under the rules governing punishment. For Mia's family, however, legal terminology could never capture the full emotional reality. Their daughter, their friend, their sister, their fellow musician was still gone. The passage of time had not softened the brutality of the crime in the way outsiders might imagine. Sometimes time changes grief. Sometimes it simply changes its shape. The first years after a murder can be filled with frantic questions. Later years may be quieter, but the absence remains. Mia could not return. Her voice could be heard on recordings, but she could not walk onto a stage. Her photographs could preserve her appearance, but they could not show what she might have become. Her friends could tell stories about her, but they could not create the future she had lost. The conviction, therefore, had a complicated meaning. It brought accountability, but not restoration. It brought an answer, but not closure in the simple sense of the word. For many families affected by violent crime, the word closure can sound inadequate. There is no single moment when grief disappears because a jury reaches a verdict. There is no sentence that balances a life. There is only the knowledge that the person responsible has been identified and that the truth has entered the official record. For Mia's friends, that truth was important. The years of uncertainty had allowed the unknown killer to become almost mythical. He had been a faceless figure in a story that seemed impossible to finish. The DNA breakthrough destroyed that anonymity. The evidence gave investigators a name. The courtroom gave the name a legal meaning, and the conviction gave the family an answer that had been denied to them for years. But Mia's story was never only about the person who killed her. It was also about the woman she had been before the crime. That distinction became especially important after the trial. Headlines naturally focused on the murder, the investigation, the DNA, and the conviction. But those headlines could never fully describe Mia. She was a musician. She was a daughter. She was a friend. She was a member of a community that had known her not because she was a victim, but because she was alive, creative, ambitious, and present. Her friends remembered the energy she brought into a room. They remembered the intensity of her performances. They remembered her humor and personality. Those memories became a counterweight to the violence that had defined the public story of her death. The G.I.T.'s music continued to carry her voice forward. In that sense, Mia remained present in a way that the killer could never control. The murderer could take her life, but he could not erase the sound she had already created. He could not erase the friendships she had built. He could not erase the memories of people who had known her. And he could not prevent investigators from eventually using the evidence he left behind to identify him. That final point became one of the most striking aspects of the case. The killer had disappeared from the immediate investigation, but the evidence remained. Nearly 10 years after the murder, DNA technology connected that evidence to MEZQUI. The case then moved rapidly compared with the years of silence that had preceded it. An investigation that had once seemed trapped in the past suddenly became active again. Detectives traveled to Florida. MEZQUIA was confronted. He was arrested. He was brought back to Washington. Prosecutors prepared their case. A jury heard the evidence, and finally, the verdict came. The transformation was extraordinary. In 1993, investigators had a murder without an identified killer. In 2004, they had a conviction. Between those 2 points was more than a decade of persistence, forensic advancement, evidence preservation, and investigative work. That timeline would later become part of the larger lesson of Mia Zapata's case. A cold case is not necessarily a dead case. Sometimes it is a case waiting for technology, information, or circumstances to change. The evidence can remain silent for years and then suddenly become loud. For Mia, that moment came when DNA turned an unknown biological trace into the name Jesus MEZQUIA for her family and friends. The verdict marked the end of one painful question, but it also created another responsibility, remembering Mia as more than the circumstances of her death. The most lasting tribute was not simply the conviction of the man responsible. It was the continued memory of the woman whose life had existed before the crime. Her music survived. Her friends survived. Her story survived. And every time her name was spoken, the victim ceased to be an anonymous figure in an old homicide file. She became Mia Zapata again, the young woman with a powerful voice, the singer who had built a life around music, the friend whose absence was felt for years, the person whose murder had once seemed destined to remain unsolved. The forensic evidence had finally broken the silence, but it was the people who remembered her who kept her story alive. And that may be the most haunting truth of all. A killer can hide for years. A case can grow cold. Technology can fail. Witnesses can disappear. Memories can fade, but evidence preserved from a crime can survive longer than the people who created it, and sometimes, When science finally catches up with the past, that evidence can speak with extraordinary clarity. In Mia Zapata's case, it spoke after years of silence. It led detectives across the country. It brought a suspect into custody. It carried a decades-old murder into a courtroom. And ultimately, it helped a jury answer the question that Seattle had been asking since the summer of 1993: who killed Mia Zapata? The answer was no longer hidden. The mystery had become history. But the memory of Mia remained, not as a cold case, not as a headline, and not simply as the name of a murder victim, but as the voice of a woman whose life ended far too soon and whose story refused to disappear. The conviction of Jesus Mezquia did something that had seemed almost impossible for years. It transformed a question into a fact recognized by a jury, and it gave Mia Zapata's family an answer after more than a decade of uncertainty. But the story of the case did not become simple just because the verdict had been delivered. The murder remained brutal, the loss remained permanent, and the legal process continued to reveal how much had depended on evidence that had been collected almost 11 years earlier. When Mia's body was discovered in Seattle on July 7th, still 1993, investigators had no idea that a small amount of biological evidence preserved from the crime would eventually become the key to identifying her killer. At the time, the case seemed to contain too few answers. There were no obvious suspects. There was no immediate confession. There was no witness who could simply walk into a police station and name the attacker. There was only a crime scene, a grieving community, and a young woman whose life had been violently taken. The investigation continued, but the years became increasingly difficult. The case entered the category of a cold case, and cold cases can create a dangerous illusion that nothing is happening. Behind the scenes, however, evidence can remain preserved while technology changes around it. That was exactly what happened in Mia's case. Seattle detectives eventually revisited the evidence and submitted DNA recovered from bite wounds on Mia's body to the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory. The first effort did not immediately produce a match. That could easily have been the end of another investigative avenue. Instead, investigators kept waiting. Then, in December 2002, a DNA profile associated with Jesus Mezquia entered a national database after he had been convicted in Florida of possessing burglar's tools. The database comparison produced the connection investigators had been searching for. The biological evidence from Mia's case matched Mezquia. Suddenly, the investigation had movement. The unknown man who had remained unidentified for years had a name. Mezquia was living in the Florida Keys, more than 3,000 miles from Seattle. That geographical distance might have seemed to create another mystery, but investigators discovered evidence placing him in the Seattle area around the time of Mia's murder. The case began to change from an unsolved homicide into a prosecution. In January 2003, Mezquia was arrested in Florida. The arrest was a dramatic moment for Seattle's cold case detective, but the emotional significance belonged to Mia's family and friends. They had lived for years without knowing whether the person responsible would ever be identified. Now they had a suspect. But a suspect was not enough. The state still had to prove its case. That meant taking evidence from a murder that had occurred more than 10 years earlier and presenting it to a jury in a way that established guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The prosecution would have to explain the DNA. It would have to establish the circumstances surrounding the evidence. It would have to show that Mezquia's presence in Seattle was consistent with the crime, and it would have to answer the defense arguments that would inevitably follow. The trial eventually began in March 2004 in King County Superior Court. By then, the murder of Mia Zapata had become part of Seattle's collective memory. She had been the lead singer of the GITs, a band that had developed a devoted following during the city's explosive music era. Her death had struck the music community with unusual force because Mia was not simply someone whose name appeared in a police report. She was someone people had watched perform, worked with, traveled with, laughed with, and loved. Her death had created an absence that could be felt in the clubs and among the musicians who had known her. During the trial, the prosecution presented the DNA evidence as the critical link between MEZQUIA and the murder. The evidence had been recovered from bite wounds on Mia's body. It had been preserved for years. It had eventually been tested and compared through the expanding DNA system. The defense challenged the state's interpretation, but the prosecution emphasized the broader circumstances. MEZQUIA was not merely connected to an unrelated biological sample. His DNA matched evidence associated with Mia's body, and investigators had evidence that he had been in the Seattle area around the time she was killed. The prosecution's case therefore rested on a combination of forensic evidence and circumstances surrounding the suspect's movements. The trial lasted more than 2 weeks. Each day carried the weight of a case that had already consumed more than a decade of investigative effort. Mia's friends and family attended. Some had been present from the beginning, when the murder had seemed impossible to solve. Others had kept her memory alive through music and memorial. They now had to sit in a courtroom and listen to the evidence describing the crime that had taken their friend away. For many of them, the trial itself was another confrontation with the past. The details that had once been whispered in grief were now being presented in a formal legal setting. The name Mia Zapata appeared again and again, not simply as the singer they remembered, but as the victim at the center of a murder prosecution. The defense had a difficult task. The DNA evidence was powerful, but the legal question remained whether the evidence proved MEZQUIA was responsible for the murder beyond a reasonable doubt. A defense attorney can challenge the circumstances surrounding biological evidence, the interpretation of forensic testing, and the conclusions investigators draw from it. The jury must weigh those arguments carefully. In a cold case, the passage of time creates another layer of uncertainty. Evidence may be old. Memories may be tested. Investigators must explain decisions made years earlier, but in Mia's case, the physical evidence had survived. That fact became one of the defining features of the prosecution. The biological evidence did not depend on someone remembering what happened 11 years earlier. It did not require a witness to reconstruct every minute of July 7th, 1993. The DNA had been preserved. It could be tested, it could be compared, it could be explained, and eventually it pointed toward one man. The jury listened to the evidence and then faced the difficult responsibility of deciding Mesquia's fate. The deliberations lasted more than 2 full days. For Mia's loved ones, those hours were filled with uncertainty. They had already waited more than 10 years. Now they had to wait again. The possibility of a hung jury remained. The possibility that the prosecution had not convinced everyone was real. A case that had survived years of investigation could still end without the verdict the family wanted. Then the jury returned. The verdict was guilty. Jesus MEZQIA was convicted of first-degree felony murder in connection with the rape and strangulation of Mia Zapata. Inside the courtroom, the emotional reaction was immediate. Mia's friends and family embraced one another. There were tears. There were cries of relief. People who had spent years carrying the uncertainty of an unsolved murder finally had a legal answer. Outside the courtroom, the meaning of the verdict was equally powerful. The person who had once been an unidentified figure in an old homicide investigation now had a conviction attached to his name. The case that had once seemed frozen had reached a verdict, but the sentence remained to be determined. In May 2004, Judge Sharon Armstrong sentenced MEZQIA to more than 36 years in prison, an exceptional sentence that was longer than the standard range for the felony murder conviction. The sentencing hearing was emotionally charged. Friends and fans of Mia attended, and some reacted visibly when MEZQIA entered the courtroom. The prosecution argued that the crime had been exceptionally cruel and violent, and that the circumstances justified a harsher punishment. The judge agreed that the evidence presented at trial established grounds for the exceptional sentence. The sentence was intended to reflect the severity of the crime, yet even that decision would not be the final word on the punishment. The defense appealed the sentence. The appeal did not erase the conviction, but it raised a legal question about whether the judge could impose a sentence beyond the standard range based on facts that had not been found by a juror. The issue was connected to a United States Supreme Court decision known as Blakely v. Washington, which had changed the constitutional rules surrounding exceptional sentences. In August 2005, the Washington State Court of Appeals unanimously affirmed Mesquia's conviction but overturned the 36-year sentence. The case was sent back to the trial court for resentencing. That distinction was important. The conviction remained. The jury's determination that Mezquia was guilty of Mia's murder was not erased. The appellate ruling concerned the sentence, not the underlying finding of guilt. For people outside the legal system, such a development could be confusing. After years of waiting, after the DNA breakthrough, after the trial and guilty verdict, why was the case still moving through the court? Because a criminal prosecution does not necessarily end when a jury says guilty. Sentencing decisions can be appealed. Constitutional questions can arise. Courts can require corrections without disturbing the central conviction. In Mia's case, the legal system was still dealing with the consequences of the trial, even though the fundamental question of responsibility had been answered. For her family and friends, however, the most important fact remained unchanged. The man convicted of killing Mia had been identified through evidence preserved from the original investigation. That fact carried enormous significance. The case had demonstrated the importance of preserving biological evidence even when an immediate identification is impossible. In 1993, investigators could not use the evidence to name the perpetrator. A decade later, they could. The difference was not that the evidence had suddenly appeared. It was that forensic technology and national DNA databases had advanced enough to make the evidence actionable. The lesson was larger than Mia's case. Cold case detectives across the country were beginning to use new forensic techniques to revisit old murders. Evidence that had once seemed insufficient could suddenly become decisive. A profile that had no match could eventually find one when a suspect entered a database years later. A person who had never been considered could suddenly become the focus of an investigation because biology had connected him to a crime. That is what happened with Mezquia. His identity emerged through the evidence. The investigation then followed that evidence across the country, from Seattle to Florida. The process was not instant. It required detectives to verify information, establish the circumstances, build a case, and present it in court. But the central breakthrough had come from a trace that had been waiting since 1993, and that made Mia's case particularly haunting. The answer had been hidden in the past, preserved in a form that investigators could not fully exploit at the time. Years passed. Technology advanced. The database expanded, and eventually, the evidence spoke. For Mia's family, that answer could never replace her. Her brother Eric expressed the reality plainly after the verdict. Someone would pay, but Mia would not return. That distinction is essential. A conviction is not resurrection. A prison sentence is not restoration. A verdict cannot give a family back the person they lost. What it can do is establish accountability. It can place the truth into a legal record. It can say that the victim's death mattered, that the evidence mattered, and that the investigation did not end simply because years had passed. Mia's name had remained alive through her music and through the people who remembered her. The conviction added another chapter to that story, but it did not define everything she had been. She had been a musician before she was a headline. She had been a friend before she was a victim. She had been a daughter before she became the center of a homicide investigation. And that was why the reaction to the verdict was so emotional. The people in the courtroom were not celebrating the end of a mystery. They were acknowledging that a part of Mia's story had finally been answered. The case had begun with a young woman walking through Seattle in the early hours of July 7th, SIL 1993. It had passed through a decade of uncertainty, a forensic laboratory, a national database, an arrest in Florida, a courtroom in Seattle, and finally a guilty verdict. But even after all of that, one fact remained impossible to change. Mia Zapata was gone. The investigation could identify the person responsible. The court could impose punishment. Science could explain the evidence. None of them could reverse the night that ended her life. What remained was memory. What remained was music. What remained was the knowledge that the evidence had not failed her. It had simply needed time, and in a cold case, sometimes time is not the enemy. Sometimes time is the reason the truth eventually becomes impossible to hide. The most extraordinary thing about the Mia Zapata investigation was not that detectives eventually found a suspect. It was how long the evidence had been waiting before anyone could turn it into an identity. For years, the case had existed in an uncomfortable space between certainty and uncertainty. Investigators knew a terrible crime had occurred. They knew Mia had been attacked and killed. They knew evidence had been collected. But they did not know the name of the man responsible. The biological evidence recovered from Mia's body was real, physical, and preserved, yet in the early years of the investigation, it could not provide the answer detectives desperately needed. The breakthrough came almost 10 years after the murder, when cold case investigators returned to that evidence and submitted DNA material from bite wounds on Mia's body to the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory. At first, there was no match. That result could have been devastating, but it was also a reminder of the central reality of forensic investigation. An unidentified profile is not the same thing as useless evidence. The profile could remain available until another profile appeared in a database. That was exactly what happened. In December 2002, DNA belonging to Jesus, MEZQU, IA entered a Florida felon database after his conviction for possession of burglar's tools. The comparison produced a match with the biological evidence from Mia's case. Suddenly, the investigation had moved from an unknown offender to a specific individual. MEZQUII was living in the Florida Keys, more than 3,000 miles from Seattle. Yet investigators determined that he had lived in Seattle for a period during the 1990s and was in the city at the time of Mia's murder. The geographic distance that initially separated the suspect from the crime scene became another part of the investigation rather than an obstacle to it. Detectives began following his history, checking records, reconstructing movements, and examining what they could establish about his presence in Seattle. The case was no longer simply about a biological sample. It had become a question of identity, opportunity, location, and circumstance. And the deeper investigators looked, the more significant the DNA connection became. The original murder had taken place on Capitol Hill. Mia had been last seen alive around 2 a.m. on July 7th, still 1993. After leaving a friend's home, about 75 minutes later, her body was found less than 2 miles away on what was then a dead-end street. The physical evidence showed that she had been brutally assaulted and strangled with the cords of her sweatshirt hood. The case had shocked Seattle's music community, but it had also created fear and anger throughout the city. Candlelight vigils were held. Friends and fans raised money to hire a private investigator. A women's self-defense organization was created in response to the fear generated by Mia's killing. And all the while, the person responsible remained unidentified. When the DNA match finally arrived, the investigation moved quickly. Detectives traced MEZQUIA to Florida. He was arrested in January 2003. The arrest represented the culmination of years of work by Seattle's cold case squad, including detectives Greg Mixell and Richard Gagnon and King County prosecutors Tim Bradshaw and Steve Falk. Their work demonstrated another essential principle of cold case investigation. Forensic technology rarely works alone. DNA may provide the breakthrough, but detectives still have to interpret it, verify it, build a timeline, identify the suspect, locate him, and prepare the evidence for court. The laboratory can provide a profile. It cannot by itself tell a jury the entire story. That responsibility belongs to investigators and prosecutors. In Mia's case, the DNA profile became the starting point for a new phase of the investigation. The detectives needed to understand who MEZQUIA was and how he had come to be in Seattle. Investigators learned that he had been born in Cuba and had lived in different parts of the United States. He had spent time in Southern California and Florida, and he had lived in Seattle for a relatively short period. Police said that, to their knowledge, Mia had not known him. That detail was significant because it meant investigators were not dealing with an obvious personal relationship. The prosecution's theory was not based on a long-standing connection between victim and suspect. Instead, it involved a stranger encounter that ended in extreme violence. The lack of a known relationship made the DNA evidence even more important. There was no obvious social connection that could otherwise explain why Mesquia's biological material was associated with Mia. The forensic evidence therefore became the bridge between two people whose lives appeared to have crossed only briefly and catastrophically. The case moved forward toward trial, but the prosecution faced a difficult task. The murder had occurred in 1993. More than a decade had passed. Memories had changed. The physical landscape had changed. The city itself had changed. Yet the prosecution still had to reconstruct what happened with enough certainty to satisfy a jury. The DNA evidence was central, but the state also had to establish the circumstances that made the match meaningful. Investigators had to explain where the biological evidence came from, how it had been preserved, how it was tested, and how it was connected to MEZQUIA. Every link in that chain mattered. If the defense could create a reasonable doubt about the evidence, the prosecution's case could collapse. That was the risk of every cold case prosecution. Time could help science, but time could also create vulnerabilities. The prosecution had to overcome both. When the trial began in March 2004, the case had already become a story of forensic persistence. The courtroom now became the place where that persistence would be tested. The prosecution presented the evidence that had finally led detectives to MEZQU. The defense challenged the state's interpretation and sought to undermine the conclusion that the DNA connection proved guilt. Jurors had to listen carefully because the case depended on more than the emotional power of Mia's story. They had to determine whether the evidence proved that MEZQUIE was responsible for the murder beyond a reasonable doubt. The trial lasted more than 2 weeks. Friends and family members attended throughout the proceeding. For them, the courtroom represented a strange intersection between the past and the present. The crime had happened more than 10 years earlier, but the details were being examined as if they had happened yesterday. Every piece of testimony brought the old case back into focus. Every reference to Mia reminded those closest to her that the young woman they remembered had been taken from them in an act of extraordinary violence. And every reference to DNA reminded them that the person responsible had finally been identified. When the evidence phase ended, the jury began deliberations. More than 2 full days passed. Those hours were tense. The family and investigators had already endured years of uncertainty. Now they faced another kind of uncertainty, one that could last only hours or days but carried enormous consequences. A jury could convict, a jury could acquit, or a jury could fail to reach a unanimous decision. For people who had waited more than a decade, even a few additional hours could feel endless. Then the verdict came. Guilt. The reaction was immediate. Mia's loved ones embraced. Tears were shed. Relief swept through the courtroom. The man whose identity had emerged from a DNA database was now formally convicted of the murder. The verdict did not erase the past. It did not make the years of uncertainty disappear, but it established a legal conclusion that had been impossible for investigators to obtain in 1993. Jesus, MEZQUIA, was guilty of the crime. The conviction was followed by sentencing. In May 2004, King County Superior Court Judge Sharon Armstrong imposed a sentence of more than 36 years, approximately 10 years above the standard range for felony murder. The judge cited the extreme injuries Mia had suffered during the attack as the legal basis for the exceptional sentence. The hearing was emotionally charged. Friends and fans filled the courtroom. Some reacted strongly when MEZQUIA appeared. The sentence was intended to reflect the severity of the crime and the circumstances established during the trial. But the legal story did not end there. MEZQUIA appealed the sentence. In 2005, the Washington State Court of Appeals unanimously affirmed his conviction but overturned the exceptional sentence. The reason was a constitutional issue arising from the United States Supreme Court's decision in Blakely v. Washington. The appellate court ruled that a factor used to extend a sentence beyond the standard range had to be found by a jury or admitted by the defendant. The conviction remained intact. The sentence was the part that was overturned. This distinction mattered enormously. It meant that the jury's determination of guilt survived. The prosecution had not lost the case. The legal system had simply required the sentencing process to comply with constitutional rules. The case therefore entered another stage, one far less dramatic than the DNA breakthrough, but just as important to the final legal record. The conviction remained the foundation. The sentence had to be reconsidered. And once again, the case demonstrated how a murder investigation can continue long after the public believes it has ended. For the people who had fought for justice for Mia, the most important achievement remained the conviction. The killer had been identified. The evidence had been tested. The jury had heard the case. And the verdict had been guilty. The years of uncertainty had finally produced an answer. Yet the significance of the DNA evidence went far beyond this one courtroom. The case showed how the expansion of DNA databases could transform old investigations. Mesquia's DNA did not enter the national system because detectives had already identified him as a suspect in Mia's murder. It entered because he had been convicted of a separate Florida offense. That profile then became searchable against biological evidence from unsolved crime. The result was a connection that investigators could not have made through ordinary police work alone. A man thousands of miles away, living a life that appeared disconnected from a Seattle homicide, suddenly became the focus of a murder investigation because his DNA matched evidence preserved from the crime. That was the power of the database. It created connections across time and geography. A sample collected in Seattle in 1993 could be compared years later with a profile generated in Florida. The crime did not need to remain local. The evidence could travel farther than the suspect ever expected. For cold case investigators, this represented a fundamental change in strategy. They could return to old evidence and ask new questions. They could test biological material that had been collected before modern forensic methods were available. They could search databases that did not exist when the crime occurred, and they could wait for the moment when an unidentified profile finally encountered a known one. Mia's case became a powerful demonstration of that process. The killer had not been identified by an eyewitness. He had not walked into a police station and confessed. He had not been discovered through a dramatic surveillance operation. He had been found because biology had preserved a connection that time could not erase. That connection eventually led detectives to Jesus Mezquii, and from there the investigation moved toward an arrest and trial. For Mia's family, the scientific breakthrough carried an emotional truth that no laboratory report could express. Their daughter, sister, friend, and fellow musician had not been forgotten. The case had not been abandoned. The evidence had not been discarded simply because years had passed. Someone had continued looking. Someone had preserved the evidence. Someone had tested it again. And eventually, someone found the name hidden inside the data. That name changed everything. It transformed a decades-old mystery into a prosecution. It gave detectives a suspect they could locate. It gave prosecutors evidence they could present. It gave a jury a case it could decide. And it gave Mia's loved ones something they had been denied for years, an answer. But answers can be complicated. Even after the conviction, people close to Mia acknowledged that no verdict could bring her back. Her brother Eric Zapata captured that reality after the guilty verdict when he said that the conviction would not bring Mia back, but at least someone would pay. That sentence contained the entire emotional weight of the case. Justice could punish, science could identify, courts could convict, but nothing could restore the life that had been taken. Mia remained absent. Her music remained. Her memory remained. And the city that had once mourned an unsolved murder now carried the memory of a case that had demonstrated the extraordinary power of evidence preserved across time. The years had not erased the truth. They had only delayed the moment when the truth could be read. And when science finally caught up with the evidence, the silence surrounding Mia Zapata's murder was broken. The DNA match had solved the identity problem, But it had also opened a darker chapter of the investigation, because once Jesus Mesquia's name entered the case, detectives began looking backward through his history, trying to understand the man whose biological evidence had connected him to Mia Zapata. What they discovered made the accusation even more disturbing. MZQU IA was not a person investigators had known from the original murder investigation. According to contemporary reporting, he had only a passing connection to Seattle, yet he had been in the city around the time Mia was killed. Police said he had lived in the Seattle area for roughly a year and a half during the 1990s. Mia, investigators believed, had not known him. Her friends did not recognize his name or photograph. That meant the connection between the two appeared to be frighteningly brief and accidental. Mia had been a musician surrounded by friends, familiar faces, and a close creative community. MEZQ IA appeared to exist outside that circle. There was no known romantic relationship, no known friendship, no established personal dispute. The DNA evidence therefore became the critical bridge between two people who otherwise appeared to have little connection. As detectives dug into Mesquia's past, they found a history that added another disturbing dimension to the case. Contemporary investigators described him as having a record of arrests and convictions involving violence against women. Records reported at the time showed arrests in Florida during the 1980s for several serious offenses. Although investigators acknowledged that the details of some of those early arrests were difficult to establish. In California, he had convictions for battery and assault and later faced other criminal charges. In 1989, he was convicted of battery involving a spouse. In 1990, he was charged with robbery and ultimately convicted of a lesser offense. In 1991, he faced another California case involving indecent exposure. These details did not prove that he had killed Mia. Investigators understood that clearly a person's criminal history cannot substitute for evidence in a murder prosecution. But the history became relevant because it helped detectives understand the suspect they were now investigating and because it raised questions about whether Mia's murder had been an isolated act or part of a broader pattern of violence. Those questions became even more disturbing because another incident occurred only weeks after Mia's death. According to charging documents reported in January 2003, a young woman walking in Seattle's Capitol Hill neighborhood noticed a car following her. Investigators linked MEZQUIA to that incident as part of their broader examination of his conduct in Seattle. The proximity in time and location attracted attention, but again, the connection did not automatically establish that he had committed Mia's murder. Detectives had to separate suspicion from proof. That distinction was essential. The case against MEZQUIA ultimately depended on evidence directly connecting him to Mia, and the strongest connection was the DNA recovered from her body. The additional information about his background could provide context, but it could not replace forensic evidence. That was why the DNA breakthrough remained so important. It gave investigators something far more powerful than a theory. It gave them a biological connection. The story of how that connection emerged was itself a remarkable example of modern cold case investigation. In the years after Mia's murder, detectives had considered numerous theories. Some focused on people close to her. Others considered the possibility of a random attacker. Investigators explored different possibilities because they did not know who had been responsible. The case had produced uncertainty rather than a clear suspect. Mia's boyfriend at the time, Robert Jenkins, later described how he had spent years mentally reviewing possible suspects. Friends did the same. They wondered whether the killer had known Mia, whether he had been watching her, whether the attack had been spontaneous, or whether something about that particular night had drawn him toward her. But none of the theories could produce a conviction. The investigation had reached a wall. The DNA eventually broke through that wall. The biological material from bite wounds on Mia's body had been preserved from the original investigation. Years later, detectives working in Seattle's cold case squad submitted the evidence for new testing. The first search did not immediately produce a name. That could have been discouraging, but the evidence remained viable. Then the circumstances changed. MEZQIA IA was convicted in Florida of possessing burglar's tools, and his DNA entered the national database in December 2002. The system made a connection that investigators had been unable to make through conventional detective work. A sample connected to a crime from 1993 matched a profile associated with a man convicted of an unrelated offense almost 10 years later. The geography was extraordinary. Seattle and the Florida Keys were separated by thousands of miles. The crime had happened in one city. The suspect was found in another state. Yet the evidence crossed the distance effortlessly. DNA has no memory of geography. It does not care how far a suspect travels after leaving a crime scene. A biological trace remains connected to the person who left it. That was precisely what happened in Mia's case. Once the match was reported, Seattle detectives followed the trail to Florida. Within weeks, they located MEZQUIA in Marathon in the Florida Keys. He was arrested in January 2003. The case that had seemed nearly impossible to solve had suddenly become an active prosecution, but investigators still had to understand how MEZQUIA had ended up in Seattle in 1993. He was a Cuban native who had come to the United States in the early 1980s. Over the years, he moved between different parts of the country, including Southern California, Seattle, and Florida. In Florida, he eventually worked as a fisherman and laborer and lived in the Florida Keys. To people around him there, he appeared to have built a different life. His wife, Nurka, AZQUII, publicly expressed disbelief that her husband could have committed the crime. She described him as a quiet man and a devoted father who enjoyed fishing. Her comments highlighted another disturbing reality of many criminal investigations. A suspect can appear completely different depending on the environment in which people know him. To investigators, MEZQUIA was now the man whose DNA had been linked to Mia. To his wife, he was the husband and father she believed she knew. The contradiction did not determine the case. The evidence would. The prosecution, therefore, concentrated on facts that could be tested. Mia had been last seen alive around 2 a.m. on July 7th, still 1993, after leaving a friend's home on Capitol Hill. Her body was found approximately 75 minutes later, less than 2 miles away. She had been raped and strangled with the drawstrings of her sweatshirt. Evidence from bite wounds eventually produced the DNA profile that matched MEZQUIA. Investigators also established that he had been in Seattle at the relevant time. These facts created a chain that prosecutors could present to a juror. The defense would have the opportunity to attack that chain, but the prosecution's theory was clear. EZQUIA had encountered Mia, assaulted her, and left biological evidence behind. More than a decade later, that evidence led police directly to him. The case also revealed how much had changed in forensic science between 1993 and 2002. When Mia was killed, DNA testing existed, but investigators did not have the same national database infrastructure that would later become so important. A DNA profile without a matching reference profile could identify an unknown offender only in a limited sense. Investigators could know that the same person had left biological material, but they could not necessarily know the person's name. That is exactly why the DNA in Mia's case remained unresolved for years. The evidence was useful, but it was not yet connected to an identity. Once Mezquia's profile entered the database, the equation changed. The unidentified profile had somewhere to go. It found a match, and suddenly the case had a suspect. This was not a dramatic discovery in the traditional sense. There was no hidden confession. There was no anonymous letter. There was no witness emerging from the shadows after 10 years. There was a database search. There was a biological sample. There was a match. And behind that match were years of evidence preservation and investigative persistence. For the detectives who had worked the case, the result must have carried enormous significance. The Seattle Police Department's Cold Case Squad had been methodically reviewing unsolved cases and using advances in forensic technology to reopen investigative possibilities. Mia's murder became one of the cases that demonstrated what that approach could accomplish. The breakthrough also changed the emotional landscape for Mia's friend. Before the arrest, the killer was an unknown figure. He could have been anyone. That uncertainty was part of the trauma. a stranger had entered Mia's story and disappeared without a name. After the arrest, the uncertainty became focused. There was an accused man. There was evidence. There would be a trial. The community no longer had to imagine every possible explanation. Instead, it could follow a legal process. Yet that process forced people to confront the details of Mia's death again. The trial would not simply be about DNA. It would require the prosecution to explain what had happened to her and why the evidence pointed to a MZQU. Friends and relatives who had spent years remembering Mia as a vibrant young musician now had to hear her final moments discussed in a courtroom. That was the price of pursuing justice. The past had to be examined in painful detail. There was no way around it. The prosecution could not simply say that DNA matched and ask the jury to accept the conclusion. It had to establish the circumstances. It had to demonstrate that MZQUIA had been in Seattle. It had to explain the biological evidence. It had to show that the evidence was properly preserved and tested. It had to connect the science to the crime. And it had to do all of this more than 10 years after the murder. That was the challenge of the case. The passage of time had helped science, but it had also complicated the human evidence. Memories had aged. People had moved. The city had changed. The music scene that had surrounded Mia in 1993 was no longer the same, but the evidence collected from her body remained. That evidence had waited quietly while the world changed around it. Then, in 2002, it found the missing piece. Jesus Mesquia's DNA entered a national database. The comparison was made. The match appeared. The cold case moved, and the man who had once been thousands of miles away from the investigation was suddenly at the center of one of Seattle's most haunting murders. The arrest did not end the mystery immediately. It transformed the mystery into a legal question. Could the prosecution prove that the man identified by DNA was also the man who had raped and murdered Mia Zapata? Could the evidence survive a courtroom challenge? Could a jury understand the science and accept the prosecution's interpretation? And could the legal system finally provide an answer that would withstand appeal? Those questions would soon become the center of the case. But one fact had already changed everything. After nearly 10 years of searching, investigators were no longer asking who Mia's killer might be. They had a name. They had a DNA connection. They had a suspect in custody. The unknown figure who had haunted the investigation since July 1993 had finally stepped out of the darkness, and the evidence that exposed him had been sitting in the case file all along, waiting for science to make it speak. The courtroom had become the place where more than a decade of uncertainty would finally be tested, and for the people who had waited since July 1993, every piece of evidence carried the weight of years. Jesus MEZQ. I sat before the jury accused of killing Mia Zapata, a crime that had remained unsolved for nearly a decade before investigators used new DNA testing to identify him. The prosecution's case centered on something that could not be seen with the naked eye, a trace of saliva recovered from Mia's body. Investigators believed the biological material came from bite marks inflicted during the sexual assault. Years earlier, the evidence had produced no useful identification, but advances in forensic technology changed that. When detectives revisited the evidence, the resulting DNA profile was eventually compared with profiles stored in national databases, and the match led them to MEZQUIA. Now the jury had to decide what that match meant. The prosecution argued that the DNA was the invisible key to the entire case. The defense argued that a DNA match did not automatically prove when or how the biological material had been deposited. That distinction became one of the central battles of the trial. Prosecutor Tim Bradshaw told jurors that the technology had finally revealed what investigators could not determine in 1993. The defense attorney, George Epler, did not dispute that the DNA belonged to MEZQUIA. Instead, the defense questioned the circumstances surrounding the DNA. Could saliva remain on skin for hours or even days? Could the biological material have been deposited before the murder? Could contamination have occurred? Those questions were designed to create reasonable doubt. The defense wanted the jury to consider the possibility that the DNA connection, while real, did not necessarily establish that Mezquia had been the person who raped and killed Mia. That argument forced the prosecution to do more than present a laboratory result. The state had to place the DNA inside the larger story of the crime. Investigators had determined that Mezquia had lived in Seattle during the period when Mia was killed. They had evidence placing him in the city around the relevant time. The prosecution therefore argued that the biological evidence was not an isolated coincidence. It was evidence connecting a man who had been in Seattle to a victim whose murder had occurred there. The defense attempted to widen the gap between those facts. If the DNA could theoretically have been deposited earlier, then the prosecution had to show why the circumstances made that explanation unlikely. If contamination was possible, then the defense could argue that the chain of evidence was less certain than prosecutors claimed. The jury therefore faced a complicated scientific and legal question. They were not simply being asked whether the DNA belonged to Mezquia. They were being asked whether the evidence, considered together with the circumstances of the crime, proved beyond a reasonable doubt that he was the man responsible for Mia's death. The case had become a battle over interpretation. One side saw the DNA as the breakthrough that had solved an otherwise impossible murder. The other saw the same evidence as something that required a more cautious conclusion. Outside the courtroom, the emotional stakes were enormous. Mia's friends and family had waited years for an answer. Some had spent the years trying to keep her memory alive through music, memorials, and public efforts to find her killer. Her death had become deeply connected to Seattle's music community, especially because the GITS had been on the verge of greater recognition when Mia was killed. The band had returned to Seattle after a West Coast tour only days before her murder. They had been building momentum. Record companies were showing interest. Their future appeared increasingly promising. Then Mia was gone. The contrast between the trajectory of her career and the brutality of her death made the case particularly painful. She had been 27. She was a singer and songwriter whose voice had already made a strong impression on the people around her. Her friends remembered her not as a symbol of an unsolved murder, but as an energetic young woman who believed deeply in her music. The courtroom could not recreate that life. It could only examine how it ended. The prosecution presented evidence describing Mia's final hours. She had spent the evening with friends on Capitol Hill. She was last seen alive around 2 a.m. on July 7th, still 1993. About 75 minutes later, her body was discovered in the 100 block of 24th Avenue South. The distance between those two moments was short. The distance between the murder and the trial was more than a decade. Investigators had to bridge that enormous gap. The biological evidence helped. The records placing Mezquia in Seattle helped, but the jury still had to understand how the evidence fit together. The defense also introduced another troubling element into the trial. The story of a man who had previously claimed responsibility for Mia's murder. That man had approached two sisters after a candlelight memorial held for Mia and reportedly told them that he had killed her. He allegedly showed them something on which he had written the words, "I killed her," and claimed that he had looked into Mia's eyes when she died. The story was disturbing. It created another possible suspect in a case that already contained years of uncertainty. But the man later told a detective that he had once believed he had killed Mia, but no longer believed that was true. He reportedly attributed his earlier belief to heroin use and said he would not forget committing a murder. The defense considered using this man's statements to create doubt about Mezquia. The prosecution, however, had evidence with a direct physical connection to Mia's body. The alternative suspect's claims were complicated by his own statements and by the absence of forensic evidence tying him to the murder. The case therefore returned again to the central question: what evidence could actually prove responsibility? The defense argued that the existence of another person who had claimed responsibility raised questions about the investigation. The prosecution could respond that people can make false confessions, particularly when there are questions about their mental state or drug use. But the most important point remained that the DNA evidence had identified Mezquia IA independently. It had not been generated from a confession. It had not been generated from a rumor. It had come from biological material preserved from the original investigation. That made the DNA evidence the foundation on which the prosecution's case stood. The defense nevertheless continued to challenge the scientific interpretation. The possibility of contamination became one of the arguments presented to the juror. The defense pointed to the fact that medical personnel had attempted to revive Mia after she was found. Could contact during the emergency response have affected the evidence? Could the biological material have been transferred in some other way? Prosecutors maintained that the circumstances of the DNA evidence made their interpretation much more compelling. The jury had to decide which explanation was consistent with the entire body of evidence. This is where forensic evidence becomes powerful in a courtroom. DNA rarely exists in isolation. Its meaning depends on location, circumstances, collection, preservation, testing, and the other facts established by investigators. A DNA match can identify a person, but the question of guilt depends on what that identification means in context. In Mia's case, the context included a violent sexual assault, the location of the biological evidence, Mesquia's presence in Seattle, and the absence of evidence suggesting that Mia and MEZQUIA had an innocent relationship that would explain the biological material. Prosecutors argued that the most logical explanation was that MEZQUIA had encountered Mia during the attack. The defense urged the jury to consider other possibilities. That disagreement became the heart of the trial. For the jurors, the responsibility was immense. They had to listen to scientific testimony while also confronting the human reality of the crime. They had to separate emotion from evidence. They could not convict simply because Mia's murder was horrific. They could not acquit simply because the case was old. They had to determine whether the prosecution had met the legal burden. The passage of time made that responsibility even heavier. More than 10 years had passed since the murder. Some witnesses were reconstructing memories from a distant night. Some evidence had been preserved for years before being tested again. The jury had to decide whether those pieces remained reliable enough to establish guilt. Yet the DNA evidence had one advantage that human memory did not. It had been preserved. The biological sample did not forget. It did not change its story. Its interpretation could be debated, but the underlying biological connection remained. That was one reason the prosecution considered it the central piece of the case. Investigators had tried the evidence before. The first DNA search had not produced a match. Then Mesquia's DNA entered the national database after a separate Florida conviction. The database comparison changed the investigation almost overnight. A profile that had once belonged to an unknown person was suddenly associated with a name. That name led detectives to Florida. The arrest followed. The trial followed the arrest. And now the jury had to decide what that evidence meant. The prosecution's narrative was direct. A man whose DNA matched biological material from Mia's body had been in Seattle at the time of her murder. He had no known innocent relationship with her. The evidence was consistent with the prosecution's claim that he had bitten her during a sexual assault. The defense's narrative was more uncertain, but legally important. A DNA match did not, by itself, prove exactly when or how the DNA reached Mia's body. If the jury believed that reasonable alternative explanations remained, then the law required acquittal. That was the standard the prosecution had to overcome. As the trial continued, Mia's friends and family listened to the arguments and waited. They had already waited nearly 11 years for the identity of the person accused of killing her. Now they were waiting for a second answer. Would a jury believe the evidence? The case had finally reached the point where science would be translated into a verdict. The DNA profile had crossed a decade. It had crossed state lines. It had transformed an unknown offender into a named defendant. But the final step belonged to the juror. The jurors would have to decide whether the invisible evidence truly told the story prosecutors said it told. The courtroom had become a place where the past was no longer simply remembered. It was being tested. Every argument, every scientific explanation, every contradiction, every alternative theory was another attempt to reconstruct a night that had happened more than 10 years earlier. And as the evidence phase approached its end, one fact became increasingly clear. The case would not be decided by the passage of time. It would be decided by whether the evidence had survived that passage of time. Mia's body had been found in 1993. The biological material had been preserved. The DNA technology had improved. A database had expanded. A suspect had been identified. Now 12 jurors had to determine whether those developments were enough to establish guilt. The answer would come after deliberation. But before that answer, the jury still had to confront the final arguments, the competing explanations, and the enormous responsibility of deciding the fate of the man sitting before them. More than a decade earlier, Seattle had been left with a murdered young woman and an unknown attack. Now the city had reached the final stage of the case. The evidence had spoken. The defense had challenged it. The prosecution had defended it. And the jury was about to decide whether that evidence had spoken clearly enough. The courtroom had heard the evidence. The DNA had been explained. The defense had challenged its meaning. The prosecution had argued that the scientific connection, combined with the circumstances surrounding Mia Zapata's murder, pointed unmistakably toward Jesus, M-E-Z-Q-U-I-A. Now there was nothing left for the attorneys to present. The case had reached the point every prosecution eventually reaches, the moment when arguments stop and 12 ordinary citizens are asked to make an extraordinary decision. More than 10 years earlier, Mia had been found dead in Seattle. For almost a decade, investigators had been unable to identify the person responsible. Now, after years of investigation and advances in forensic science, one man stood accused. The jury had to determine whether the evidence proved that he was the killer. The question sounds simple. It was not. The jurors had heard about a brutal murder committed in 1993. They had heard about the biological evidence recovered from Mia's body. They had heard how that evidence eventually produced a DNA profile and how the profile was matched to MEZQIA through a national database. They had heard that MEZQIA had been in Seattle around the time of the murder. They had heard arguments about contamination, timing, and alternative explanation. They had also heard about another man who had once claimed responsibility for Mia's death. Every element had to be weighed against the legal standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The jury could not simply decide that MEZQIA was probably responsible. Probability was not enough. Suspicion was not enough. The horrific nature of the crime was not enough. The state had to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That burden had been at the heart of the prosecution from the moment MEZQIA was charged. Now it rested entirely with the juror. For Mia's friends and family, the deliberations represented another period of waiting in a case that had already consumed years of their lives. They had waited through the original investigation. They had waited through the cold years when there was no suspect. They had waited for the DNA breakthrough. They had waited for the arrest. They had waited through the trial. And now they had to wait again. The jury deliberated for more than 2 days. The passage of those hours created another layer of uncertainty. A fast verdict might have suggested that the evidence had been overwhelming. A long deliberation could mean anything. Jurors might be examining complex scientific evidence. They might be discussing contradictions. They might be reviewing testimony. They might be divided. No one outside the jury room could know. That uncertainty was particularly difficult for the people who had lived with the case for so long. More than 10 years earlier, they had lost Mia. Now they were waiting to learn whether the legal system would hold someone responsible for her death. Eventually, the jury returned to the courtroom. The moment had arrived. The foreperson announced the verdict. Jesus MEZQIA was found guilty of first-degree felony murder. The decision represented the culmination of more than a decade of investigative work. The man whose DNA had been identified through forensic testing was now legally convicted of Mia Zapata's murder. The reaction among Mia's supporters was emotional. People embraced. Tears were shed. Relief followed years of uncertainty. For investigators, the verdict confirmed that the cold case investigation had successfully translated forensic evidence into a criminal conviction. For Mia's family, it meant something more complicated. They finally knew that the person responsible had been identified and held accountable. But they also knew that nothing could restore Mia's life. The verdict could not return her to the stage. It could not restore the future she had been building. It could not give her family another conversation with her. Justice had been achieved in a legal sense, but grief remained. That distinction would become an important part of how people remembered the case. The prosecution had not simply solved a mystery. It had prosecuted the killing of a real person whose life had mattered to an entire community. Mia had been 27 when she died. She was not known to the world because of the crime. She had already built an identity before the murder. She was a musician, a performer, and a member of the GITS. She had moved from Louisville to Seattle and immersed herself in the city's music scene. Her band had been developing a following, and friends believed that she had a future in music. The murder interrupted all of that. Her career stopped. Her friendships were changed. Her family was forced into a reality they had never imagined. The verdict could only address the crime. It could not address everything Mia had been or everything she might have become. The sentencing phase followed. In May 2004, EZQUIA received a sentence of more than 36 years in prison. The sentence was longer than the standard range because the judge imposed an exceptional sentence based on the circumstances of the crime. The prosecution had argued that Mia's injuries and the violence inflicted upon her justified punishment beyond the standard sentencing range. Judge Sharon Armstrong agreed and imposed the longer term. For people attending the sentencing, the hearing represented another emotional milestone. The man convicted of killing Mia was no longer merely an accused murderer. He was a convicted killer facing decades in prison. The legal system had formally established consequences for his action, but the sentencing hearing also exposed one of the unavoidable limitations of criminal justice. A prison term can punish a defendant. It cannot repair a family. It cannot undo trauma. It cannot return a victim to the people who loved her. It can only impose accountability within the boundaries of law. Even then, the legal process was not finished. MEZQUIA appealed the sentence, arguing that the exceptional punishment had been imposed in violation of constitutional protections. His appeal relied on the United States Supreme Court's decision in Blakely v. Washington, which had been issued in 2004. That decision had significant consequences for Washington's sentencing system. It held that, in circumstances involving sentences above the standard range, facts used to justify the increase generally had to be found by a jury or admitted by the defendant. Mesquia's lawyers argued that the judge had relied on facts that had not been found by the juror. The Washington State Court of Appeals agreed with the legal argument concerning the sentence. In 2005, the court unanimously affirmed Mesquia's murder conviction but overturned the exceptional sentence. The case was returned for resentencing. For the public, the appellate decision could sound like a reversal. It was not. The conviction remained intact. The jury's guilty verdict was not erased. The court did not declare MEZQUIA innocent. It ruled that the sentence had been imposed improperly under the constitutional rules governing exceptional punishment. That distinction mattered because the central outcome of the trial remained unchanged. The evidence had been sufficient to convict. The sentence simply had to be reconsidered according to the law. The legal development also illustrated how complicated the end of a cold case can be. The public often imagines a simple sequence: investigation, arrest, trial, conviction, end. Real cases rarely work that way. Appeals can continue. Sentences can be challenged. Evidence can be reviewed. Court sets can issue decisions years after a jury has spoken. In Mia's case, the conviction survived the first major appellate challenge, while the sentence was sent back for reconsideration. The legal record therefore continued to evolve even after the dramatic moment when the jury said guilty. But the most important investigative question had already been answered. The DNA evidence had identified MEZQUIA. Investigators had connected him to the crime. The jury had accepted the prosecution's case. The cold case had been solved. For Seattle, the conviction brought an end to one of the city's most painful unsolved mysteries. The case had become deeply embedded in the memory of the music community. Mia's murder had changed how many people viewed safety. Her friends and fellow musicians had spent years confronting the possibility that the person who killed her might never be found. Some had continued to campaign for answers. Others had kept her memory alive through music. The conviction gave those efforts a definitive result, yet there was another part of Mia's legacy that could not be captured in courtroom documents. Her music remained. The GITS recordings preserved her voice. Those recordings became a way for people to encounter Mia as she had been before the murder. That mattered because crime reporting can reduce a victim to the circumstances of death. Headlines describe the violence. Court documents describe the evidence. Prosecutors describe the injury. But none of those things describe the ordinary life that existed before the crime. Mia had friends. She had ambitions. She had music. She had a future. Remembering those things prevented the murder from becoming the only story told about her. The case therefore developed a parallel narrative. One was the investigation, evidence, DNA, databases, detectives, arrest, trial, conviction. The other was Mia's life, music, friendship, creativity, and the community she left behind. The first narrative explained how the killer was found. The second explained why the loss mattered. Both were necessary to understand what the case meant. The DNA breakthrough also became a symbol of the changing nature of criminal investigation. In 1993, investigators could collect biological evidence but could not necessarily connect it to a named individual. By the early 2000s, national DNA databases had become increasingly important investigative tools. A person convicted of an unrelated offense could provide a DNA sample. That profile could later be compared with evidence from unsolved crimes. The result was a kind of investigative time machine. Evidence from the past could be compared with people identified in the present. In Mia's case, that mechanism transformed a biological trace into a suspect. The technology did not replace detective work. It amplified it. Detectives still had to investigate MEZQUIA. They had to locate him. They had to establish his connection to Seattle. They had to work with prosecutors. They had to prepare the case. But without the DNA match, none of that would have happened in the same way. The database provided the first crucial bridge. The conviction, therefore, represented more than one case being solved. It showed what could happen when old evidence met new technology. It showed why investigators preserve biological evidence even when there is no immediate suspect. It showed why a case should not necessarily be considered hopeless simply because years have passed, and it demonstrated how a forensic profile without a name can become a name when circumstances change. For Mia's loved ones, the technological lesson was secondary to the human one. They wanted her killer found. They wanted the uncertainty to end. They wanted the world to know that Mia had not been forgotten. The guilty verdict provided part of that answer. But there was no illusion that justice could undo the law. Her brother Eric Zapata expressed the complicated emotions surrounding the conviction by acknowledging that the verdict would not bring Mia back, even though the person responsible would face punishment. That sentiment captured the reality of the entire case. The investigation had succeeded. The prosecution had succeeded. The jury had reached a verdict. But the tragedy remained a tragedy. The best outcome the justice system could provide was accountability. It could not provide restoration. Years after the conviction, Mia's name continued to carry meaning in Seattle's musical history. Her voice remained preserved in recordings. Her story continued to be told. The murder that had once been an unsolved mystery became an example of how forensic science can revive a case that appears dormant. The evidence had survived. The investigators had persisted, the database had eventually produced the map, and the courtroom had accepted the prosecution's interpretation of that evidence. The sequence was complete. A murder in 1993, an unidentified offender, years of uncertainty, a DNA profile, a database match in 2002, an arrest in 2003, a trial in 2004, a guilty verdict, a sentence, an appeal, and a conviction that survived the challenge. But beneath that timeline was the life of a woman who should have had decades more. Mia Zapata was 27 when she died. The investigation lasted almost half as long as her entire life. That fact alone reveals the extraordinary passage of time involved in the case. She had lived a short but intensely creative life. Her killer had spent years unidentified. Her friends had spent years asking questions. Detectives had spent years searching, and eventually the evidence answered. Not with a confession, not with a dramatic revelation, with DNA, a microscopic biological trace became the bridge between 1993 and 2002. It carried investigators across nearly a decade and eventually into a courtroom. The jury then transformed that evidence into a verdict. And with that verdict, one of Seattle's most haunting cold cases became a solved murder. Yet even after the legal system had spoken, Mia's story remained larger than the conviction. The final image was not simply a courtroom or a prison sentence. It was the memory of a young singer whose voice had once filled Seattle clubs and whose life had been interrupted by an act of terrible violence. The killer could be named. The evidence could be explained. The verdict could be recorded. But Mia could never be reduced to the person who killed her. Her life existed before the crime, and her memory continued after it. That was the part no court could measure and no DNA test could capture. And perhaps that was the most enduring consequence of the case. The investigation finally answered who had killed Mia Zapata, but the people who loved her continued answering a different question for years afterward. Who was Mia beyond the crime? The answer lived in her music, in the memories of her friends, and in the community that refused to let her disappear into a police file. The cold case had been solved. The mystery had ended. But Mia's story did not. The conviction had answered the central question of the investigation, but the story of Mia Zapata did not end when the jury delivered its verdict, because solving a murder and understanding its impact are two very different things. For more than a decade, the case had existed as an open wound in Seattle. Mia had been killed in July 1993, and for years the person responsible remained unidentified. Her friends continued living with the knowledge that someone had taken her life and walked away. Her family had to carry the uncertainty of not knowing whether the killer would ever be found. Detectives had to live with an investigation that had produced evidence but no name. Then the DNA match changed everything. Jesus Mezquia was arrested in Florida in January 2003, prosecuted in Washington, and convicted in March 2004. The legal process had transformed a cold case into a solved homicide. But the emotional consequences did not disappear with the verdict. If anything, the conviction forced many people to confront the full reality of what had happened. During the years when the case remained unsolved, the unknown killer could be imagined as almost anyone. The absence of an identity created a permanent question mark. After the arrest, that uncertainty had a face and a name. For people who had known Mia, that could be both relieving and disturbing. The person they had wondered about for years was no longer an abstraction. He was a real man who had been located thousands of miles away and brought back to Washington to stand trial. The transformation was one of the defining features of the case. In 1993, investigators had been looking for an unknown offender. In 2002, forensic science gave them a name. In 2003, police had a suspect in custody. In 2004, a jury found him guilty. The timeline demonstrated how a cold case can move suddenly after years of apparent inactivity. But the public often misunderstands what happens during those silent years. A cold case is not necessarily an abandoned case. Investigative files can remain open. Evidence can remain preserved. Detectives can return to old reports. Laboratories can revisit biological material when new testing becomes available. Databases can grow. Technology can change. A case that could not be solved in one decade can become solvable in another. Mia's murder became one of the clearest examples of that principle. The evidence was not discovered after the passage of time. It had been collected during the original investigation. What changed was the ability to interpret it and connect it to an individual. That distinction is crucial. The killer did not suddenly leave new evidence behind in 2002. Instead, an old piece of evidence acquired new significance because Mezquia's DNA eventually entered a database. The connection was created by technology, but technology alone was not enough. Investigators still had to recognize the significance of the match and determine whether it could support a prosecution. They had to locate him Mezquia, examine his background, establish that he had been in Seattle, and construct a case that could withstand scrutiny. The process required patience because DNA evidence is powerful but not magical. It identifies biological material. It does not automatically reconstruct an entire crime. investigators must still determine how the material arrived at the scene when it was deposited and whether the circumstances are consistent with the prosecution's theory. That was exactly why the trial mattered. The defense challenged the meaning of the DNA. The prosecution argued that its location and the circumstances surrounding the murder made the explanation clear. The jury ultimately accepted the state's case and convicted MEZQU. The verdict became the legal conclusion of the investigation, but it also became a landmark moment for Seattle's cold case effort. The case demonstrated what could happen when investigators refused to treat an old homicide as permanently unsolvable. The Seattle Police Department had created a cold case squad in part to revisit older investigations, and Mia's murder became one of the cases that benefited from this approach. Detectives examined evidence that had been collected years earlier and looked for opportunities created by advances in forensic science. That work eventually led to the DNA testing that produced the crucial profile. Without that renewed attention, the biological evidence might have remained in storage without ever producing a name. The story also showed why preserving evidence matters. At the time of the murder, investigators could not know exactly what forensic technology would become capable of in the future. They could not know that national databases would expand or that a future conviction in another state would place the killer's DNA into a system that could connect him to an unsolved Seattle homicide. They could only preserve what they had. Years later, that preservation became essential. The biological material recovered from Mia's body had survived long enough for new science to use it. The evidence had effectively outlived the original investigation. That is one of the most powerful aspects of forensic cold case work. Time can destroy some evidence, but properly preserved biological material can remain useful for decades. The science may evolve, the database may expand, the suspect may move across the country, but the biological connection remains. In Mia's case, that connection crossed almost 10 years before it finally produced a name. It was an extraordinary reminder that evidence does not have to speak immediately to be valuable. Sometimes it speaks only when someone knows how to listen. The conviction also brought renewed attention to Mia herself. During the investigation and trial, news coverage naturally focused on the murder and the search for the killer, but friends repeatedly emphasized the person behind the headlines. Mia was a musician. She was the lead singer of the GITs. She had a distinctive voice and a strong stage presence. She had become part of Seattle's underground music culture during a period the city was developing a reputation as one of the most important music centers in the United States. Her death, therefore, carried a particular cultural impact. The music community did not simply lose a performer. It lost a young artist whose career was still developing. The GITs had been gaining attention. Their music had attracted